My daughter-in-law quietly erased my name from my grandson's graduation guest list because my presence didn't fit her high society aesthetic. I didn't beg for a ticket. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply made a single phone call to the university's endowment office by Friday afternoon. She was sobbing in the middle of a crowded country club. Before we get into this, do me a favor and drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from today. I always love seeing where you all are listening from. And if you have ever had to quietly stand your ground against family who underestimated you, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button before we continue. My name is Shirley Presley. I am 67 years old. For 35 years, I worked as a director in investment banking. In my line of work, we had a rule. We don't panic when an asset is severely overvalued. We don't scream at the ticker tape. We just wait for the market to correct itself. And my daughter-in-law, Eleanor, was a severely overvalued asset. I have one grandson. His name is Leo. From the moment he was born, he was the absolute light of my life. He is a good kid, quiet, hardworking, the kind of boy who actually listens when you speak to him. He spent the last 4 years pushing himself to the absolute limit at a very prestigious, very expensive private university. And he thought, everyone in the family thought, he was there on a miraculous, anonymous full-ride scholarship. Eleanor, on the other hand, treated Leo's university like her own personal country club membership. She is a woman who measures a person's worth by the logo on their handbag and the zip code on their mortgage. My son? David. Well, David chose the path of least resistance a long time ago. He married a woman who needed to be seen. And he decided his job was to stand in the background and hold her purse. We were 3 weeks away from graduation. 3 weeks away from the moment Leo would walk across that stage. Eleanor had been planning the weekend like it was a royal coronation. But not for Leo. For herself, she had invited David's managing partners, her wealthy socialite friends, people who didn't even know my grandson's middle name, and somewhere in her desperate need to impress these people, she decided that a 67-year-old widow in a sensible wool cardigan was going to ruin her aesthetic. I remember sitting in my living room, drinking my morning tea, when I first realized what she was doing. The subtle exclusions, the way she would change the subject when I asked what time the ceremony started, the way she would physically step in front of me if one of her important friends came to the door. She thought I was just an old woman who didn't understand how the modern world worked. She thought I was blind to the game she was playing. But you don't survive 3 decades on Wall Street without learning how to read the room, and I was reading her like a cheap, fragile spreadsheet. To really understand what happened that week, you have to understand the kind of boy Leo is. My grandson did not inherit his mother's desperation for approval. And thank God for that. He is a quiet soul. The kind of kid who would rather dismantle a broken radio to see how it works than go to a crowded party. When he was little, after my husband passed away, Leo would come over to my house and just sit with me on the back porch for hours. We didn't even have to talk. He just knew I needed the company. That is the boy I am talking about. A boy with a good heart and a sharp mind. When it came time for college, Leo set his sights on a prestigious private university on the East Coast. One of those places with thick ivy crawling up the brick walls and an endowment larger than the gross domestic product of a small country. The tuition was astronomical, simply out of the question for a normal family. Eleanor, of course, was absolutely thrilled when he applied. She didn't care about the engineering program. She didn't care about the world-class faculty. She only cared about the glossy bumper sticker she could put on the back of her leased luxury SUV. But David and Eleanor did not have the money to send him there, They lived in a beautiful house in a gated community. They drove beautiful cars. They wore beautiful clothes. But in my line of work, you learn very quickly how to smell debt. I spent 35 years looking at corporate balance sheets. I know what a hollow foundation looks like. They were living paycheck to paycheck on a 6-figure salary. So, when Leo got his acceptance letter, it came with a thick envelope from the financial aid office. A full-ride academic scholarship. Anonymous donor. The endowment covered his tuition, his housing, his books, everything. I remember the day he ran into my living room holding that letter. He was crying. He told me he was going to make the donor proud. Whoever they were, he told me he was going to work harder than anyone else in that school. And he did. For 4 solid years, Leo practically lived in the university library. He took advanced courses. He interned over the summers instead of going to the beach. He thought he owed his entire future to the kindness of a stranger. He had no idea that the stranger was sitting right across from him at the dinner table, drinking a cup of Earl Grey tea. I never told him. I never told anyone. When my husband and I were building our life, we made some very smart, very quiet investments. We lived entirely below our means. When I retired from the bank, I set up a private trust. I didn't want my grandson starting his adult life chained to heavy student loans, but I also knew, with absolute certainty, that if Eleanor found out I had that kind of capital, she would never stop asking for it. She would drain that trust dry to fund her country club lifestyle before Leo even finished his freshman year. So, I kept my mouth shut. I let the university act as the middleman. Over those 4 years, Eleanor made Leo's college experience entirely about herself. Every time I went over to their house for Sunday dinner, she was wearing a different piece of university merchandise. A $200 sweatshirt here, a silk scarf with the school crest there. She would loudly drop the name of the university into casual conversations with the cashier at the grocery store. It was pathetic. Really, but I let her have her fun. I didn't care about her vanity. I only cared about my grandson getting his education in peace. David, just let it all happen. My son is not a bad man, but he is a weak man. He works as a senior manager at a corporate logistics firm. It is a demanding job. But no matter how much money he brought in, Eleanor spent it faster. He spent his life trying to fill a bucket with a massive hole in the bottom. Whenever Eleanor would make a snide comment about my plain clothes, or my small house, or my old car, David would just look down at his plate. He chose peace with his wife over respect for his mother. I suppose I can't blame him for wanting a quiet house, but I never respected his silence. As graduation approached, the atmosphere in their house changed. It became frantic. Eleanor wasn't planning a celebration of Leo's hard work. She was planning a high-stakes networking event. David's firm was going through a major merger, that off-less, and he was trying desperately to secure a partnership. Eleanor decided that Leo's graduation weekend was the perfect opportunity to impress the senior partners from New York. She invited them to the ceremony. She invited them to a lavish dinner she could not afford. She was using her son's academic achievements as a shiny lure to catch a promotion for her husband. And in that frantic, desperate scramble to look like a high society matriarch, Eleanor looked at me. She looked at my sensible shoes. She looked at my gray hair. She looked at the fact that I drove a 10-year-old sedan, and she made a calculation. She decided I was a liability. She decided that introducing me to the senior partners would shatter the illusion of generational wealth she was trying so desperately to project. She didn't know that she was dealing with a woman who used to approve and deny multi-million-dollar corporate loans for a living. She didn't know that I could see right through her leased clothes and her maxed-out credit cards. She just saw an old lady in a cardigan. That was her first mistake. assuming that quiet meant powerless. I spent my entire career sitting in boardrooms full of loud, arrogant men who thought they were the smartest people in the room. I never had to shout to get my way. I just had to wait for them to make a bad investment. Eleanor was making the worst investment of her life. And she was doing it with my grandson's big day. I was not going to let that happen. But I was not going to throw a tantrum either. I was going to let her build her house of cards exactly as high as she wanted before I pulled out the bottom row. Let me tell you a little bit more about Eleanor. To call her a social climber would be a severe understatement. She was a woman who was perpetually auditioning for a life she could not afford. In the world of finance, we call that being dangerously over-leveraged. You borrow heavily against your future to pay for your present, hoping that eventually the two will magically align. Let me tell you from experience, they never do. Eleanor grew up in a perfectly normal, middle-class household, just like my son David. But somewhere along the line, she decided that being normal was a disease. When she married David, he was just starting out at his corporate logistics firm. They had a modest apartment. It was nice. It was clean. But it was not enough for her. Over the years, as David slowly climbed the corporate ladder, every single raise, every single year-end bonus was instantly swallowed by Eleanor's desperation to look like she came from old money. She did not understand that real wealth is quiet. Real wealth does not need to scream at the valet. Real wealth does not wear logos the size of a dinner plate. I spent my life around people who could buy and sell entire city blocks, and most of them dressed like they were going to mow the lawn. But Eleanor bought completely into the illusion. She leased a luxury sedan that cost more per month than their mortgage. She bought designer handbags on installment plans. She forced David to join a country club they could barely afford the minimum monthly spend on, just so she could post photos of herself drinking overpriced mimosas on a Tuesday afternoon. And this graduation weekend was supposed to be her absolute masterpiece. For 4 years, Leo had been out of the house, living in a small dorm room, eating cheap cafeteria food, and studying until his eyes bled. He was completely detached from the circus. His mother was running back home. But now, his graduation at this elite university was the perfect excuse for Eleanor to throw the ultimate networking event. I went over to their house about 2 weeks before the ceremony. I needed to drop off a watch I had repaired for Leo. A simple, elegant vintage piece that belonged to his grandfather. When I walked through the front door, the house was in absolute chaos. Not happy family chaos. Corporate event chaos. Eleanor was standing in the middle of the living room, barking orders into her cell phone. She had actually hired a private event planner to organize a dinner party for the evening after the graduation ceremony. I stood quietly in the hallway and listened. She was arguing loudly about the floral arrangements. She was insisting on imported white orchids, demanding they be flown in fresh, completely ignoring the fact that the florist was telling her over the phone that her credit card had been declined twice already. I watched her face tighten in sheer panic, then smooth out into a mask of fake confidence as she gave them another card number. I knew that look. I had seen that exact same look on the faces of desperate executives sitting across my desk, trying to convince me that their failing company just needed one more bridge loan to turn things around. It is the look of a person who knows the ground is crumbling beneath their feet, but absolutely refuses to look down. When she finally hung up, she turned and saw me standing there. She immediately smoothed down her expensive silk blouse and forced a wide, tight smile. "Oh, Shirley," she said, her voice dripping with that artificial sweetness she always used when she was trying to establish dominance. "I did not hear you come in. We are just so incredibly busy with the preparations. The managing partners from New York are flying in. You know, They absolutely insisted on coming to celebrate Leo's achievement. I knew for a fact they did not insist. Eleanor had been hounding David to invite them for 6 solid months. She wanted to use the prestige of the university and the prestige of Leo's fake anonymous scholarship to show these partners that David came from the right kind of family, the kind of family that belonged in the senior leadership circle. I just smiled and set the small wooden box with the watch on the entryway table. I told her I just wanted to drop off a graduation gift for Leo. She glanced at the worn wooden box, and I saw her lip curl just a fraction of an inch. She actually reached out and pushed the box behind a large, garish crystal vase. She did not want anything looking old or sentimental, ruining the aesthetic of her expensive foyer. "We are hosting a very exclusive dinner for the partners after the ceremony," she told me, crossing her arms defensively. "It is going to be quite sophisticated. We are having a private chef come to the house. It is a networking thing for David. Really, extremely high stakes. I am sure you understand." I understood perfectly. I understood that she was setting the stage to exclude me. But she could not just say it outright. She needed to frame it as if she was doing me a favor. "It is going to be very late, Shirley," she continued, her eyes scanning my plain wool sweater from top to bottom, "and very crowded. Lots of shop talk. Honestly, it will probably be incredibly boring for you. I was thinking it might be better if you just rested at home after the ceremony. We can do a quiet family lunch on Sunday. Just the 4 of us. At a diner or something?" I did not argue. I did not point out that she was treating me like an embarrassment that needed to be hidden away while the important company was over. I simply looked at her. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could completely hide. The crushing stress of maintaining the lie was eating her alive. "That sounds like a very practical plan, Eleanor," I said calmly. "I would not want to disrupt David's networking." She exhaled a long breath. She did not realize she was holding. She thought she had won. She thought I was just a tired old woman rolling over to accommodate her grand vision. She had no idea that I was just taking mental notes. Every slight, every lie, every desperate attempt to project a wealth she did not possess. I was building a complete financial and moral profile of the woman who thought she was outsmarting me. Just as I was turning to leave, David walked downstairs. He looked completely exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, and he was carrying a stack of mail, mostly bills with red urgent stamps printed on the envelopes. He saw me and offered a weak, tired smile. "Hi, Mom," he said, barely looking up from the envelopes. I asked him how he was doing. He started to say something, started to tell me he was stressed out. But Eleanor immediately cut him off. She stepped directly between us, physically blocking my view of my son. "David is doing wonderfully," she announced loudly. "The firm is incredibly impressed with him. Everything is perfectly on track for the big promotion." David looked down at the floor. He shuffled the unpaid bills into his leather briefcase and closed it with a loud snap. He did not correct her. He did not tell me the truth about their situation. He just stood there, letting his wife construct a beautiful, fragile glass house right on top of a massive sinkhole. I told them I would see them soon, and I walked out to my 10-year-old car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before turning the key. I was not angry. Anger is a useless emotion in my line of work, and this had just become work. I felt a profound sense of clarity. Eleanor was willing to bankrupt her family to impress strangers, and she was willing to erase me to maintain her illusion. She wanted a high society reckoning. She had no idea she was about to get one. 4 days after I dropped off that vintage watch, I was back at their house for our mandatory Sunday dinner. Only, it did not feel like a family dinner. It felt like a dress rehearsal. Eleanor was treating the entire evening like a dry run for the high-stakes networking event. She was planning for the following week. When I walked into the dining room, I actually had to stop and stare for a moment. The table was set with heavy crystal goblets, an excessive amount of silverware, and a massive, elaborate floral centerpiece that completely blocked your view of the person sitting across from you. It was ridiculous. It was a Sunday evening in the suburbs, and she had set the stage for a state banquet. Leo was already sitting at the table, looking incredibly uncomfortable in a stiff-collared shirt that his mother had clearly forced him to wear. He caught my eye and gave me a small, apologetic smile. I just winked at him and took my seat. I was wearing my favorite charcoal gray wool cardigan. It is a very practical piece of clothing. It keeps me warm. It is comfortable, and I have owned it for at least 10 years. Eleanor came bustling out of the kitchen, looking frantic. She was wearing a silk dress that looked far too tight and a pair of heels that had no business being worn inside a private home. She was carrying a platter of something tiny and heavily garnished. She set it down and immediately took her seat. And right there, on the empty chair next to her, sat her brand-new quilted leather designer handbag. She had actually placed it on a dining chair, like it was an honored guest. I knew exactly how much that bag cost. I also knew exactly what the interest rate was on the credit card she used to buy it. The dinner was incredibly tense. Leo tried his best to make normal conversation. He started talking about his senior engineering project, something about fluid dynamics and structural integrity. I was fascinated. I loved hearing his mind work. But he barely got 3 sentences out before Eleanor completely cut him off. "Oh, Leo. Sweetie, nobody wants to hear about boring math tonight?" she said, waving her hand dismissively. "We need to focus on next weekend. We need to talk about how you are going to present yourself to Arthur and the senior partners. You need to talk about your leadership skills, not your little science projects." Leo looked down at his plate. He picked up his fork and just started pushing his food around. He was used to this. He was used to his mother steamrolling over his actual passions to mold him into a trophy she could show off. Then, Eleanor turned her sights on me. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and gave me that fake, sugary smile. "Shirley, I wanted to talk to you about the events next weekend," she said, her voice dripping with a condescending tone that made my teeth ache. "When the managing partners are here, it is going to be a very sophisticated crowd, people who understand modern wealth and corporate culture. I would really appreciate it if we kept the conversation focused entirely on David's recent achievements and Leo's prestigious academic scholarship." She paused and looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on me worn wool cardigan. "We want to project the right image. Shirley," she continued, leaning back in her chair, "try not to talk about your little retirement hobbies. Okay? The thrift store shopping, the gardening, the old folks club. It just confuses people of a certain caliber. They do not understand that kind of simple lifestyle, and I do not want them thinking David comes from a background that lacks ambition." The dining room went completely silent. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Leo's head snapped up. "Grandma is not simple," he said, his voice rising just a little bit. "She is the smartest person I know. You do not get to talk to her like that." I reached under the table and gently tapped Leo's knee. I gave him a very calm, very steady look that told him to stand down. I did not need a 21-year-old boy defending me, and I certainly did not want him ruining his own peace of mind right before his final exams. I turned my attention back to Eleanor. I looked at her heavily powdered face, I looked at the designer handbag sitting proudly on the chair next to her. I looked at the sheer desperation vibrating in her shoulders. She was terrified that my plain cardigan would somehow shatter the fragile glass house she had built on a foundation of massive credit card debt. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my hobbies. I did not list out my past corporate titles or explain that I used to manage portfolios worth more than her entire neighborhood. I simply picked up my water glass, took a slow, measured sip, and set it back down on the coaster. "Of course, Eleanor," I said quietly. "I understand completely. I would not dream of confusing your guests." The visible wave of relief that washed over her face was almost comical. Her shoulders dropped. She let out a long breath and smiled brightly. Completely oblivious to the trap she had just walked into, she mistook my silence for surrender. She believed, with the absolute arrogant certainty that defined her entire existence, that she had won. She thought she had successfully put the old, boring widow in her place. She had no idea that I was not retreating. I was just taking a step back to admire the sheer height of the cliff she was about to walk off. Let me tell you about the silence that followed Eleanor's little speech at that dinner table. After she told me to keep my simple retirement hobbies to myself so I would not embarrass them in front of her high society guests, the room went completely still. I did not look at her. I did not need to. I already knew exactly who and what she was. Instead, I looked across that massive, ridiculous floral centerpiece right at my son. I looked at David. I sat back in my chair. And I just waited. I gave him the floor. I gave him 10 full seconds of absolute, unbroken silence to step up, to be a husband who corrects a boundary, to be a father who sets an example for his son, to be a man who defends the mother who raised him. He is 42 years old, a senior logistics manager for a major corporation, a man who oversees dozens of employees and million-dollar supply chains, but in that moment, sitting in the shadow of his wife's fragile, monstrous ego, he looked exactly like a frightened little boy, hoping the storm would just pass over his head. He picked up his heavy crystal water glass. His hand was actually shaking just a fraction of an inch. He took a slow sip. Set the glass back down exactly on the center of his coaster. And he looked at his plate. He did not look at me. He did not look at Leo, who was staring at him with a mixture of hope and utter disbelief. David cleared his throat. "It is just a networking thing." "Mom," he mumbled, his voice tight and quiet. "Eleanor is right. We just need everything to go perfectly smoothly for the managing partners next weekend. There is a lot of money on the line for this promotion. You know how these corporate guys are. It is just for one night." I felt something shift inside my chest right then. It was not anger. It was not even sadness. It was a very cold, very profound disappointment. In my 35 years in investment banking, I saw a lot of different ways a business could fail. Some failed because of bad market conditions. Some failed because of malicious fraud. But the saddest failures, the ones that were the hardest to watch, were the ones caused by weak leadership. A CEO who knows the ship is taking on water, but refuses to patch the hole because he does not want to upset the passengers. Eleanor was a malicious actor. That was easy to deal with. You just cut off their funding. But David was complicit. He was the enabler. He worked in logistics. His entire career was built on moving things from one place to another to keep the machine running. And that is exactly what he was doing with his family. He was moving his own dignity, his own integrity, and his mother out of the way, just to keep Eleanor's illusion running for one more day. I looked at my grandson. Leo was gripping his fork so hard, his knuckles were completely white. He was watching his father fold under pressure, and you could practically see the respect draining out of the boy's eyes. That was the real tragedy of that dinner table. A boy learns how to navigate the world by watching his father, and David was teaching Leo that avoiding a tantrum was worth sacrificing your own backbone. I was not going to let Leo absorb that lesson. I picked up my napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and I smiled at my son. Apolite. Empty. Corporate smile. I understand perfectly. David, I said, my voice smooth and entirely devoid of any emotion. You have to protect your investment. I would not want to do anything to jeopardize your big promotion. Eleanor let out a sharp little laugh. She reached over and patted David on the arm, looking incredibly pleased with herself. "C'est," she said brightly. "Your mother understands. It is just business." I finished my dinner in silence. I ate the dry, overcooked chicken. I complimented the overly complicated side dishes. I played the part of the obedient, simple, slightly confused old woman to absolute perfection. Eleanor talked for another 45 minutes about the private chef she had hired, the imported wine she had ordered, and the exact seating chart she had designed for her imaginary high society friends. When it was time for me to leave, I stood up and gathered my things. I put on my old wool cardigan. Leo jumped up to help me, walking me toward the front door. He looked miserable. "Grandma, I am so sorry about dinner," he whispered. When we were out of earshot of the dining room, "You do not have to listen to her. You are coming to my graduation. I want you there." I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. I looked into his earnest, hard-working eyes. He had earned that anonymous scholarship 10 times over with his dedication, completely unaware that his grandmother was the one funding it. "Do not worry about me, Leo," I told him quietly. "I am going to have the best seat in the house. You just focus on your final exams. Let the adults handle the rest." David walked out into the hallway just as I was opening the front door. He lingered back a few steps, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked exhausted. "Mom?" he said softly. "I really am under a lot of pressure right now. If I do not get this partnership, I do not know how we are going to keep up with everything. The mortgage, the cars, the lifestyle. Eleanor just wants everything to be perfect." I stood in the doorway. The cool evening air was rushing in from the outside. I looked at my son, and I gave him one last piece of advice. Not as his mother, but as a former financial director, I know you are under pressure. "David," I said, "but pressure only breaks things that are hollow. If your foundation was solid, you would not have to hide your own mother to keep the house standing." I walked out to my car and drove home. The complicity of his silence had told me everything I needed to know. I was not just dealing with a greedy daughter-in-law anymore. I was dealing with a system that was completely and permanently defunct, and it was time to let the market crash. 2 days after that disastrous Sunday dinner, I found myself back at their house. It was a Tuesday morning. The air outside was crisp, the kind of perfect spring morning that makes you feel like everything in the world is exactly where it should be. David and Eleanor were both at work, and Leo was back on campus, finishing up his last 2 final exams. I was only there because David had called me the night before, sounding completely exhausted, and asked if I could let the plumber in to fix a leaking pipe in their guest bathroom. Eleanor was too busy finalizing the menu for her extravagant dinner party, and David could not afford to take time off work right before his partnership review. So, being a mother, I drove over with my spare key and a good book to wait for the repairman. The house was perfectly quiet. It was a stark contrast to the frantic, suffocating energy that usually filled those rooms when Eleanor was home. I let the plumber in. directed him upstairs to the guest bathroom, and went into the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea. While I was waiting for the water to boil, I walked into David's home office to grab a coaster from his desk. I did not go in there to snoop. I spent my entire career dealing with confidential documents. I have a profound respect for privacy. But some things are not hidden. Some things are left right out in the open because the person who left them there believes they are completely untouchable. Right in the center of David's heavy mahogany desk was a thick, glossy folder. The cover had the crest of Leo's University printed in heavy gold foil across the top. Written in Eleanor's looping, aggressive handwriting were the words VIP, Seating and Master Itinerary. I stood there for a moment, just looking at it. The folder was slightly open, and I could see a thick stack of printed seating charts and confirmation emails sticking out. Now, you have to understand how this university handles its graduation ceremonies. It is a massive, highly secure event. The general admission seating in the main stadium is open to anyone, but the VIP section, the section right down on the field next to the stage where the graduates walk, is strictly limited. Each graduating student is given exactly 4 VIP tickets. No exceptions. No extras you can buy. 4 tickets. For Leo. That meant his mother, his father, his maternal grandmother, who lived in Florida, and me. At least, that was the math I had been working with. I reached out and flipped the cover of the folder open. The very first page was a master layout of the VIP seating area. Eleanor had actually color-coded the chairs using little highlighters, like she was mapping out a military invasion instead of a family celebration. I traced my finger down the list of names assigned to the Presley family block. David Presley, Eleanor Presley. Below that, Leo's other grandmother, and then, on the 4th line, where my name had been typed out by the university, there was a thick, jagged line drawn through it in bright red ink. The paper was actually torn slightly, where the pen had pressed down too hard. It was not a mistake. It was an execution. Right next to my crossed-out name, written in that same aggressive red ink, was the name Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance was the senior managing partner at David's logistics firm, the man who held the key to the promotion Eleanor was so desperate to secure. I picked up the piece of paper. My hand did not shake. I did not gasp. I just stared at that red line. Eleanor had not just suggested I stay home. She had not just implied I would be bored. She had actively, secretly contacted the university and transferred my ticket to a corporate executive. She had traded my moment of watching my only grandson graduate for a networking opportunity. I stood in that quiet, expensive home office, and I put the pieces together. Eleanor knew she could not just tell Leo she was taking my ticket. Leo would have absolutely refused. He would have caused a scene, and he might have even given his own ticket away just to make a point. So, she was going to lie to him. She was going to wait until the morning of the ceremony, when it was too late to fix anything, and tell him there had been a clerical error. She would say the university made a mistake, or that I had suddenly fallen ill, or that the tickets were lost. She would spin some elaborate web of confusion, and then, oh, what a happy coincidence. Mr. Vance is here. We can just give him the spare seat so it does not go to waste. It was a brilliant, cold, calculating move. In the corporate world, we would call it a hostile takeover. You wait until the target is vulnerable. You freeze their assets. And you install your own board members before anyone realizes what is happening. She thought I was just an old woman who would sit quietly at home and watch the live stream on a tablet, crying over my tea. too embarrassed to make a fuss. She thought she had neatly removed the frayed, outdated wool cardigan from her perfect high society picture. I slowly placed the seating chart exactly where I found it. I closed the glossy folder. I made sure it was angled perfectly on the desk, precisely how she had left it. I did not want her to know I had seen it. I did not want to disrupt her false sense of security. I walked back into the kitchen. The kettle was whistling loudly. I poured the hot water over my tea bag. Leaning against the marble counter, I felt a profound, absolute calm wash over me. It is a very specific feeling, the feeling you get when the market finally reveals its hand and you realize you hold all the winning cards. Eleanor had made her move. She had decided that I was worth nothing to her family. She had decided that my love for my grandson was entirely expendable if it got in the way of her ambition. She had absolutely no idea that she had just crossed out the name of the sole benefactor funding the multi-million-dollar endowment that was paying for her son's entire education. She had no idea. She had just locked the bank vault from the inside and thrown the key out the window. I drank my tea in silence. When the plumber finished his work, I paid him out of my own pocket, locked the front door behind me, and walked out to my car. I was not going to cry. I was not going to call David and beg for a ticket. I was going to let Eleanor have exactly what she wanted. I was going to let her have her empty chair. But first, I needed to have one final conversation with her. I needed to look her in the eye and give her one last chance to tell the truth. Not because I thought she would, but because I needed to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the financial reckoning I was about to unleash upon her was absolutely and entirely deserved. I decided not to wait until Sunday to see how Eleanor was going to play her hand. I wanted to look her in the eye and watch her build the lie from the ground up. So, on Thursday afternoon, I called her and asked if she had time for a quick cup of coffee at a little cafe near her house. I told her I just wanted to finalize the transportation details for graduation morning. She arrived 20 minutes late. She walked into that quiet, modest little coffee shop carrying 3 different shopping bags from high-end boutiques downtown. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair and a silk trench coat that probably cost more than her husband's monthly car payment. She looked entirely out of place. And she made sure everyone in the room knew it by sighing loudly as she squeezed past the small tables. She sat down across from me, dropping the heavy shopping bags onto the floor with a very deliberate, exhausted thud. "I am so sorry I am late." "Surely," she said, not sounding sorry at all. The boutique was an absolute nightmare. The event planner needs me to review the final floral arrangements for the dinner party. And I still have to pick up David's suit from the dry cleaners. It is just nonstop. I slid a menu across the table toward her. I told her to take a breath. I told her I just needed 5 minutes of her time to figure out when we were leaving for the university on Sunday. I watched her face very closely. I spent my career sitting across from chief executive officers who were trying to hide multi-million-dollar losses in the footnotes of their quarterly reports. I know what a lie looks like before it even leaves a person's mouth. I saw the tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles around her jaw. I saw her eyes dart down to her perfectly manicured hands for just a fraction of a second before she looked back up at me with a wide, artificial smile. "Oh, surely," she said, her voice dropping into that sugary, condescending tone she used whenever she was about to do something awful. "I am so glad you brought that up. I have actually been meaning to call you all morning. There has been a bit of a situation." I did not say a word. I just sat back in my wooden chair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for her to present the fraudulent prospectus. "It is the university," she continued. leaning forward and lowering her voice as if she was sharing a terrible secret. They sent an email last night. Apparently, there was some massive clerical error in the ticketing office. A glitch in their system, or something ridiculous like that. They accidentally overbooked the VIP section, and they had to cut back the family allotment for several students. She paused, letting out a dramatic, sympathetic sigh. We only received 3 tickets. Surely, just 3. David, myself, and my mother. I tried to argue with them. I spent an hour on the phone with the administration this morning. I really did. But they said there is absolutely nothing they can do. It is a fire marshal issue. Apparently, it was a masterful performance. If I had not seen that glossy folder sitting on David's desk with my name crossed out in bright red ink, I almost would have believed her. She did not stumble over her words. She did not break eye contact. She lied with the absolute, unassailable confidence of a woman who truly believed she was the smartest person in the room. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. And what did Leo say about this clerical error? I asked quietly. Her smile froze just a little bit at the edges. Well, I have not told Leo yet, she said quickly. He is finishing his absolute last final exam today. I did not want to ruin his concentration. I am going to break the news to him tonight. He is going to be heartbroken. Of course. But he will understand. She reached out and placed her hand over mine. Her fingers were ice cold. Besides, surely, she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. Let us be completely honest with each other. It is going to be a 3-hour ceremony. They are forecasting 90-degree heat for Sunday afternoon. The stadium seating is terribly uncomfortable. A woman of your age, sitting out in that brutal sun for hours, it just would not be safe. It is probably a blessing in disguise. It is much better for your health to just stay in the air conditioning. Relax in your comfortable chair and watch the live stream on your computer. I looked at her hand resting on mine. I looked at the massive diamond ring she had forced David to upgrade for their 10th anniversary. A ring they were still making minimum monthly payments on. I decided to give her one last chance. A final exit ramp before I closed the highway. Eleanor, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. If there is another reason I am not going to this ceremony, if you needed that ticket for someone else, someone important for David's career, perhaps you can just tell me the truth. I am a reasonable woman. For a split second, I saw genuine panic flash in her eyes. She realized, just for a moment, that I might know, but her arrogance quickly swallowed the panic whole. She snatched her hand back from mine and sat up perfectly straight, her face hardening into a mask of pure, self-righteous indignation. I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Surely, she snapped, her volume rising enough to make the woman at the next table look over. I am trying to protect your health. And you are accusing me of lying? Why do you always have to do this? Why do you always have to make everything so difficult and create drama where there is none? This is Leo's big day, not yours. You should be happy for him instead of acting like a victim. There it was, the classic pivot. When a fraudster is backed into a corner, they do not apologize. They attack the person asking the questions. They try to make you feel crazy for noticing the missing money. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I did not call her a liar. I simply picked up my paper napkin, wiped the corner of my mouth, and nodded slowly. You are right, Eleanor, I said calmly. It is Leo's big day, and I would not dream of causing a scene or making things difficult for your family. I will stay out of your way on Sunday. The profound, visible wave of relief that washed over her features was almost tragic to watch. She exhaled a long breath, and the hard lines of her face completely melted away into a triumphant, victorious smile. She honestly thought she had successfully manipulated me. She thought she had gaslighted the old widow into submission, securing the VIP seat for the corporate partner without leaving any fingerprints on the crime scene. I walked out of that little coffee shop and got into my 10-year-old sedan. I did not put the key in the ignition right away. I just sat there in the driver's seat, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. And I looked back through the large glass window of the cafe. Eleanor was practically glowing. I watched her pull her expensive smartphone out of her designer handbag. She immediately started typing furiously, a massive, triumphant smile spreading across her face. I imagined she was texting David, or perhaps her overpriced event planner, letting them know that the Shirley problem had been successfully and quietly handled. She waved the barista over and confidently ordered another pastry, leaning back in her wooden chair like a queen who had just conquered a small, insignificant country. She had won. That is what she truly, deeply believed in that moment. There is a very specific kind of danger in dealing with someone who thinks they are a master manipulator, but lacks the intelligence to actually back it up. In the banking world, we call it the peak of a speculative bubble. It is that exact, terrifying moment when a terrible, fundamentally flawed investment looks exactly like a brilliant one. The investor feels invincible. They feel like they have outsmarted the entire market. They have no idea that the underlying assets are completely worthless and the floor is about to fall out from under them. Eleanor was riding the absolute peak of her own fraudulent market. She genuinely believed that her flimsy, poorly constructed lie about a university ticketing error had completely neutralized me. In her mind, I was nothing more than a sad, tired, naive old woman who was going to spend her grandson's graduation day sitting on the couch, drinking tea, completely oblivious to the fact that my rightful seat was being kept warm by a corporate logistics executive. She thought I had surrendered because I was too old and too weak to fight back. She mistook my absolute silence for total submission. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine of my old car hummed to life, steady and reliable. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I did not feel a single ounce of anger. Anger is a remarkably useless emotion when you are preparing to dismantle someone's life. Anger makes you sloppy. Anger makes you raise your voice, send aggressive text messages, and leave unhinged voicemails that can be used against you later. I did not want to yell at my daughter-in-law in a crowded coffee shop. I wanted to completely and permanently foreclose on her reality. I drove back to my house on the quiet side of town. It is a modest, single-story property with a small garden in the back. The paint is plain. The furniture is old. And the driveway is completely empty of luxury vehicles. But it is paid off. In full, 15 years ago. There is no mortgage hanging over my head. There are no high-interest equity lines slowly bleeding my accounts dry. It is just quiet, solid, untouchable ownership, a concept Eleanor could not possibly comprehend. When I walked through my front door, the silence of the house wrapped around me like a heavy, comforting blanket. I took off my wool cardigan, hung it neatly on the coat rack, and walked straight into my home office. Up until that afternoon in the coffee shop, I had been willing to tolerate a lot of things. I had been willing to let Eleanor play her little high society games. I had swallowed the snide comments about my clothes, my car, and my simple hobbies. I had endured the forced exclusion from her fancy dinner parties and the constant, suffocating condescension. I was willing to endure all of it, silently and politely, As long as Leo got to walk across that stage and start his adult life without a mountain of student debt crushing his shoulders. But Eleanor had not just insulted my wardrobe this time. She had crossed a massive, unforgivable red line. She had actively stolen my presents from my only grandson on the most important day of his life, and she had done it not out of necessity, but out of pure, unadulterated vanity. She had decided that my quiet, unconditional love for Leo was entirely disposable if it got in the way of her impressing a man who probably did not even know her husband's middle name. She was willing to break Leo's heart and lie to his face on his graduation morning. All to secure a networking opportunity for a promotion they needed to pay off her credit cards. I sat down at my heavy oak desk, the same desk I had used since I retired from the firm. I looked out the window at my garden for a long time. I thought about David. I wondered if he knew the details of the lie Eleanor was spinning, or if he was just willfully blinding himself to it, playing the part of the obedient, silent husband to keep the peace. It did not really matter anymore. His complicity had made him a co-signer on her emotional debt. And when the market crashed, he was going to go down with her. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel sorry for myself. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. Eleanor wanted to play a high-stakes game of wealth and influence. She wanted to show off her power and her connections. She wanted a ruthless corporate environment. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a small, heavy steel lockbox. I set it on the desktop, the metal cold against my hands. I punched in the 4-digit combination. The lock clicked with a sharp, heavy sound that echoed in the quiet room. I lifted the lid. It was time to show my daughter-in-law exactly what a real hostile takeover looked like. Inside that heavy steel lockbox were 3 thick, securely bound folders. The documents inside were crisp, formal, and represented a quietly accumulated net worth that would have made Eleanor drop to her knees and weep. I pulled out the first folder and laid it flat on my desk. It contained the founding trust documents for something called the Shirley Presley Anonymous Educational Endowment. When my husband and I were building our life together, we made a very specific choice. We lived in a modest house. We drove practical cars, and we took simple vacations. But behind the scenes, we were investing heavily. I spent 35 years in the upper echelons of investment banking. I understood how money worked. I understood compound interest, offshore tax structures, and high-yield asset management. When I retired, I walked away with a portfolio that most corporate executives only dream about. But I never told my son the full extent of it. David knew we were comfortable, of course. But he did not know we were wealthy. And when he married Eleanor, I knew I had to bury that information as deep as I possibly could. Money is a funny thing. It is a magnifier. It takes whoever you already are and just makes you more of it. If you are a generous person, money makes you a philanthropist. If you are a greedy, status-obsessed social climber, money turns you into a monster. If Eleanor had known exactly how much capital I had sitting in my private accounts, she would have never stopped asking. She would have drained every single cent to fund her fake country club lifestyle, and she would have destroyed my grandson's future in the process. So, I kept my mouth shut. I let her make her snide comments about my old clothes. I let her treat me like a poor, simple widow. But when it was time for Leo to go to college, I knew I had to step in. I was not going to let that bright, hard-working boy drown in heavy student loans just because his mother was spending his college fund on designer handbags and leased luxury vehicles. I did not just write a check to the university. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I contacted my private wealth manager and set up a blind trust I transferred a massive sum of money into an endowment fund, managed entirely by a third-party legal team, specifically earmarked to cover the full tuition, housing, and living expenses for one singular engineering student, Leo Presley. The University Financial Aid Office was legally bound by a strict non-disclosure agreement as far as Leo, David, and Eleanor knew. Leo had won a highly competitive completely anonymous academic scholarship. They had absolutely no idea that the anonymous donor funding that multi-million-dollar endowment was the same woman Eleanor had just uninvited to the graduation ceremony. I sat at my desk and ran my hand over the thick parchment paper of the trust document. Eleanor thought she was so incredibly smart. She thought she had successfully manipulated the seating chart to impress a logistics executive, securing a promotion to pay off her credit cards. She had no idea. She had just locked the bank vault from the inside and thrown the key straight out the window. I reached for my phone. It was time to stop being the quiet, compliant old woman. It was time to go back to work. I dialed a private number I knew by heart. It rang twice before it was answered. "Marcus," I said into the receiver. "I hope I am not interrupting your afternoon." Marcus had been my primary legal counsel and wealth manager for over 15 years. He was a brilliant, meticulous man who spoke softly, moved quietly, and handled hundreds of millions of dollars without ever breaking a sweat. He knew my family dynamic. He knew exactly why I had set up the blind trust for Leo. And he had zero patience for people who mistreated the elderly. "Surely," he replied, his voice warm but professional. "You never interrupt. What can I do for you today?" I told him everything. I told him about the disastrous Sunday dinner. I told him about the glossy folder sitting on David's desk with my name crossed out in red ink. And I told him about the little meeting at the coffee shop, where Eleanor looked me dead in the eye and lied about a university ticketing error so she could give my VIP seat to her husband's managing partner. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Marcus did not gasp. He did not express fake sympathy. He was a professional, and he knew exactly what kind of call this was. This was not a complaint. This was an authorization for a tactical strike. That is incredibly unfortunate. Marcus finally said, his voice dropping an octave into a cold, clinical tone. "It seems your daughter-in-law has made a severe miscalculation regarding her primary benefactor. How would you like to proceed?" "I have 2 requests." "Marcus," I said, looking out my window at the quiet garden. "First, I need you to contact the dean of the university. You are the legal administrator of the endowment, which means you have direct access to the board of directors. I want a slight adjustment made to the graduation script for this Sunday." I explained exactly what I wanted the university president to say when Leo walked across that stage. I wanted the veil of anonymity completely lifted. I wanted the truth broadcasted through the stadium speakers. Marcus actually let out a low inhalation, appreciative chuckle as he wrote down my instructions. "Consider it done," he said. "The dean will be more than happy to accommodate our request. Given the size of your ongoing financial contributions to their engineering department. And your second request?" I opened the second folder in my lockbox. This one contained older documents from 10 years ago, when David and Eleanor first bought their massive, overly expensive house in that gated community. At the time, David did not have the credit history to secure the mortgage on his own. I had quietly co-signed as a legacy guarantor to help him get the approval, under the strict condition that they refinance and remove my name within 5 years. I knew for a fact they had never refinanced. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I am still listed as a legal guarantor on David and Eleanor's primary mortgage. That gives me the right to request a full, forensic audit of their current financial liabilities to ensure my own credit is not at risk. I want you to pull everything, their credit card debt, their auto leases, their equity lines. I want to see exactly how close they are to the edge of the cliff. Marcus paused for only a second. I can run a quiet credit inquiry through the firm's private investigative channels. He said, "They will never even know we looked. I will have the complete file on your desk by tomorrow morning." "Thank you, Marcus," I said. "I will wait for your call." I hung up the phone and closed the lockbox. The gears were officially in motion. I was not going to yell at Eleanor. I was not going to demand my ticket back. I was going to let her put on her expensive dress, pack her high society guests into the VIP section, and sit back in absolute arrogance. I was going to let her climb all the way to the top of her fragile glass tower before I shattered the foundation. The next morning, I woke up exactly at 6 o'clock, just like I have every single day for the past 40 years. I made my bed. I brewed a pot of Earl Grey tea. I walked out to my small backyard and spent an hour pulling weeds from my tomato garden. The soil was damp and cool against my hands. It was a perfectly ordinary, perfectly quiet Friday morning. You would never know, just by looking at me, that I was preparing to dismantle my son's entire financial existence. At precisely 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Marcus. I wiped the dirt off my hands, went inside, and picked up the receiver on the third ring. I carried the phone into my home office and sat down at my heavy oak desk. I had a yellow legal pad and a pen ready. "Good morning, Shirley," Marcus said. His voice was brisk, stripped of any casual small talk. "I have the results of the forensic audit you requested. I ran a comprehensive soft pull on all accounts tied to David and Eleanor, focusing specifically on the liabilities where you are listed as a legacy guarantor." "Tell me," I said simply. I heard the rustle of heavy paper on his end of the line. "It is significantly worse than we anticipated, Shirley," he said, and I could hear a rare trace of genuine disbelief in his tone. "They are not just living paycheck to paycheck. They are operating a domestic Ponzi scheme. They are using new debt to pay the minimum balances on old debt." I wrote the word debt on my legal pad and underlined it twice. "How bad is the exposure?" "Marcus, let us start with the primary residence," he said. "You co-signed the original mortgage 10 years ago. They were supposed to refinance and remove your name after 5 years. Not only did they fail to do that, but 3 years ago, Eleanor convinced David to take out a massive home equity line of credit. They tapped every single dollar of equity they had in that property. The house is completely underwater. If they tried to sell it today, they would still owe the bank hundreds of thousands of dollars." I closed my eyes for a brief second. I pictured the garish floral arrangements Eleanor had ordered for her dinner party. I pictured the private chef. She was paying for luxury with money she had effectively stolen from her own future. "And the consumer debt?" I asked. "Absolutely staggering," Marcus replied. "I am looking at 6 different high-yield credit cards. All of them are either maxed out or within a few $100s of the limit. The interest rates are completely predatory. They are currently 60 days past due on 2 of the cards. And it gets worse. Those 2 luxury vehicles sitting in their driveway? They are both leased. And David has missed the last 2 monthly payments on his SUV. The financing company has already issued a preliminary warning. They are about 30 days away from repossession. I sat in the quiet of my office and let the sheer magnitude of their stupidity wash over me. In my 35 years of investment banking, I had seen companies go bankrupt. I had seen executives lose everything because they made bad bets on the market. But this was not a bad market bet. This was deliberate, daily, Systematic self-destruction. Eleanor had built a beautiful, shining castle on top of a massive sinkhole, and she was standing on the balcony, demanding everyone admire the view. There is a hard deadline approaching. Surely, Marcus continued, his voice dropping lower. I pulled David's corporate compensation structure. His base salary cannot even cover the minimum payments on this mountain of debt. The only thing keeping them afloat is the anticipation of his annual executive bonus and the pay raise that comes with making senior partner. If he does not secure that promotion next week, the entire house of cards collapses by the end of the month. They will default on the mortgage, the cars will be repossessed, they will be entirely ruined. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped together with perfect, crystal clarity. That was why Eleanor was so desperate. That was why she was acting like a cornered animal. She was not just trying to impress her high society friends. She was trying to save her own life. She needed David to get that promotion because it was the only way to avoid total financial ruin. She was using Leo's graduation ceremony and the prestige of the anonymous endowment as a glittering distraction. She was going to parade Leo around in front of Arthur Vance, the senior managing partner, hoping the man would be so dazzled by the family's supposed academic pedigree that he would hand David the promotion and my presence, the presence of a plain, frugal, sensible grandmother in an old wool cardigan, threatened to shatter that illusion of generational wealth. She could not afford to have Arthur Vance look at me and realize that David came from a perfectly normal, middle-class background. She needed the empty chair. She needed the networking opportunity. She was willing to completely erase me from my grandson's life to secure a paycheck to cover her maxed-out credit cards. Are you still there? Surely. Marcus asked quietly. I am here. Marcus. I said. What are your instructions? He asked. As the legal guarantor on that mortgage, you have the absolute right to freeze the equity line and trigger a mandatory financial review with the bank. We can lock down their accounts today to protect your own credit rating. It would stop them dead in their tracks. I looked out the window. A small bird landed on the edge of my tomato garden, picked up a seed, and flew away. The world outside was so calm, so completely oblivious to the storm I was holding in my hands. No, I said softly. Excuse me, Marcus said, sounding genuinely surprised. Do not freeze the accounts today. I told him, if we lock them down now, Eleanor will just play the victim. She will blame the bank. She will cry and scream and ruin Leo's entire graduation weekend before he even gets to walk across the stage. I am not going to let her turn my grandson's achievement into a pity party for her own financial incompetence. I picked up my pen and drew a slow, deliberate circle around the word debt on my legal pad. Let her have her weekend. Marcus, I said, my voice completely cold and entirely steady. Let her buy her imported orchids. Let her hire her private chef. Let her put on her expensive silk dress and sit in the VIP section next to Arthur Vance. Let her climb all the way to the absolute top of her fragile little glass tower. I paused, letting the silence hang on the line for a moment. And then, I said, on Monday morning, exactly 24 hours after my grandson has his diploma in his hand, you are going to file the paperwork to formally withdraw my name as the guarantor on that mortgage. You are going to notify the bank of their immediate insolvency that I want every single line of credit frozen. And I want the foreclosure process initiated. I could hear Marcus let out a long, slow breath on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a man who fully appreciated the sheer, devastating finality of a perfectly executed corporate strike. Understood. Surely, he said quietly. I will prepare the documents. They will not see it coming. They never do. I replied. I hung up the phone. I folded my hands on the desk. I did not feel any anger anymore. Eleanor wanted a high-stakes world of wealth, power, and ruthless ambition. She wanted to play the corporate game. I was just going to show her exactly what happens when you sit down at a table you cannot afford. And the dealer finally calls your bluff. In my 35 years of investment banking, I learned a very strange, very consistent truth about financial ruin. The Friday before a massive corporate collapse is never quiet. It is almost always the loudest, most extravagant day of the company's history. When desperate executives know the ship is going down on Monday morning, they do not start rationing the lifeboats. They throw a frantic party on the upper deck. They order everyone to drink the most expensive champagne. They need to feel completely untouchable one last time before the cold water finally hits their knees. That is exactly what Eleanor was doing that entire weekend. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for Sunday afternoon. By Saturday morning, Eleanor had officially turned her heavily mortgaged house into a staging ground for a high society lifestyle. She was actively defaulting on. I did not even have to drive over there to see the circus. She was broadcasting the entire fraudulent production to the world on her social media pages. I sat in my quiet living room, drinking my morning tea, and watched her updates roll in on my tablet. She posted a picture of 36 imported white orchids being arranged on her kitchen island. The caption was a long and laborious, exhausting paragraph about the heavy demands of hosting senior corporate partners and how perfectly she was curating the aesthetic for the weekend. She did not mention the stack of bright red past due notices sitting in the junk drawer right beneath those beautiful flowers. She posted a video of the private chef she had hired, a man who was currently unloading premium cuts of meat from a refrigerated van into her driveway. I looked at the video closely. I could see David's leased luxury SUV parked in the background. The exact same vehicle that Marcus had told me was 30 days away from being violently repossessed. It was a masterpiece of absolute delusion. She was standing in the middle of a burning building, demanding that everyone compliment the new curtains she had just bought on a maxed-out credit card. Around 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked out the window and saw Leo's beat-up 10-year-old compact car. He had driven over from the university campus, entirely unannounced. When I opened the front door, my grandson looked completely exhausted. He was wearing an old gray t-shirt and faded jeans. He did not look like a boy who was 24 hours away from graduating at the top of his engineering class. He looked like a hostage who had just briefly escaped his captors. "Hi, Grandma," he said, letting out a long, heavy sigh. "Do you mind if I just sit on your back porch for a while? The house is an absolute nightmare right now." I smiled, stepped aside to let him in, and told him he could stay as long as he needed. I went into the kitchen, poured 2 tall glasses of iced lemonade, and brought them out to the patio. We sat in the quiet shade of my backyard for a long time before he finally spoke. "I cannot take it anymore." "Grandma," he muttered, staring down at his glass. "Mom is treating my graduation like it is a corporate trade show. There are caterers bumping into floral designers in the hallway. She has been screaming at Dad all morning because the specific vintage of wine she ordered for Arthur Vance has not arrived yet. It is not even about me. It has never been about me. She just wants to use my degree to get Dad a promotion." I listened to the frustration in his voice. I felt a sharp, familiar pang of protectiveness in my chest. This boy had spent 4 years grinding through advanced calculus, pulling all-nighters in the university library, and proving himself worthy of the massive anonymous trust fund I had built for him. He deserved a weekend of pure, uncomplicated celebration. Instead, he was being used as a shiny hood ornament on his mother's sinking luxury vehicle. I know it is difficult, Leo, I said gently, but tomorrow is your day. When you walk across that stage, they will be calling your name, not your mother's name, not Arthur Vance's name. You earned this entirely on your own merit. Nobody can ever take that away from you. He managed a small, tired smile. He leaned back in his chair and looked out at my tomato garden. I just want tomorrow to be over, he admitted quietly. I just want to get my diploma. Say thank you to whoever runs that anonymous endowment. And get out of there. At least the actual ceremony will be nice. Mom said she is picking up the 4 VIP tickets from the university administration office first thing tomorrow morning. I kept my face perfectly still. I did not blink. I did not react. I cannot wait to look down and see you sitting right there in the front row. Grandma, he continued, completely oblivious to the massive lie his mother was currently spinning. Seeing you there is the only thing that is going to keep me sane when Arthur Vance starts giving his unsolicited career advice. He truly believed I was going to be there. Eleanor had not told him the lie yet. She was cowardly. She was going to wait until the absolute last possible second, probably Sunday morning while they were rushing out the door, to deploy her fake story about a clerical error and a lost ticket. She was going to trap him in a situation where he had absolutely no time to argue or fix the problem. I reached across the small patio table and put my hand over his. My hand was steady. Do not worry about a single thing, Leo, I told him, looking directly into his earnest eyes. I promise you, tomorrow is going to be exactly the way it is supposed to be. I am going to have the absolute best seat in the entire stadium. I am going to watch every single step you take. He squeezed my hand back, visibly relaxing. He trusted me completely. Leo stayed at my house for another 2 hours. We did not talk about his mother or the dinner party anymore. We talked about his final engineering project. We talked about the job interviews he had lined up for the following month. We sat in the quiet, solid reality of my home, entirely insulated from the chaotic, crumbling illusion taking place across town. When he finally got up to leave, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. I stood on the porch and watched him drive away. I walked back inside and locked the door. The weekend of waiting was officially over. The false triumph had reached its absolute peak. Eleanor had bought the flowers. She had hired the chef. And she had stolen the ticket. She had built her fragile glass tower as high as it could possibly go. I went into my bedroom and laid out my clothes for the next day. I did not pull out a sensible wool cardigan. I pulled out a tailored, charcoal gray suit, the exact same suit I used to wear when I walked into corporate boardrooms to inform arrogant executives that their funding had been permanently revoked. Tomorrow was graduation day, and class was officially in session. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat. The air was thick and humid. Exactly as Eleanor had predicted when she tried to convince me that my fragile health could not possibly survive an outdoor ceremony. I woke up, drank my tea, and went to my closet. I did not reach for my sensible wool cardigan. I did not put on the plain, comfortable clothes of a quiet, retired widow. Instead, I pulled out a tailored, charcoal gray suit. I paired it with a crisp silk blouse and a pair of very expensive very quiet leather shoes. I put on a simple pearl necklace that my husband had given me 30 years ago. When I looked in the mirror, the tired, easily confused grandmother was completely gone. I looked exactly like what I was. A retired director of investment banking preparing to execute a highly calculated, absolutely devastating corporate liquidation. I found out later exactly how Eleanor played her final hand that morning. It was a textbook pressure tactic, executed with the cold precision of a desperate woman. She waited until exactly 45 minutes before they had to leave for the stadium. Leo was already dressed in his black cap and gown, nervous, excited, and pacing the hallway. David was sweating profusely in a heavy suit he could barely afford. And that is when Eleanor casually dropped the bomb. She stood in the middle of her expensive foyer and told Leo about the massive clerical error. She told him the university had suddenly slashed their ticket allotment. She spun a beautiful, tragic story about how I had graciously volunteered to stay home because the heat index was simply too dangerous for a woman of my age. And then, with perfect, practiced innocence, she mentioned that Arthur Vance, the senior managing partner at David's firm, was already in town for the dinner party. She told Leo it would be a terrible, unforgivable insult to his father's career not to offer the empty seat to such an important corporate guest. Leo was absolutely furious. He saw right through the timing of the announcement. He immediately pulled out his phone to call me, to tell me he was coming to pick me up, regardless of what the ticket said. But I had intentionally turned my cell phone off the night before. It went straight to voicemail. He had absolutely no time to argue. He had no time to drive across town to my house. He was trapped. Eleanor had engineered the situation perfectly to ensure his complete and utter compliance. She forced him into the back of their least luxury vehicle, securing her victory right as the clock ran out. I arrived at the university stadium an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The campus was an absolute sea of chaos. There were thousands of people swarming the walkways. Proud parents, nervous students, vendors selling overpriced flowers and university merchandise. The line for the general admission gates wrapped all the way around the parking lot. I did not walk toward the main entrance. I did not walk toward the standard VIP check-in tent where Eleanor was currently dragging her family and her corporate guest. I walked around to the quiet, shaded west side of the stadium, toward a heavy set of tinted glass doors marked strictly for university administration and private endowment donors. The lobby inside was completely silent and wonderfully air-conditioned. A young woman in a sharp navy blazer was standing behind a polished mahogany podium. I walked up to her and quietly gave her my name. She typed my name into her tablet, and I watched her entire posture instantly change. She stopped chewing her gum. She stood up a little straighter, her eyes widening just a fraction of an inch before she offered me a warm, incredibly respectful smile. She did not hand me a paper ticket. She stepped out from behind the podium and personally escorted me to a private elevator hidden behind a decorative partition. I was not going to be sitting on folding chairs on the hot stadium grass. I was being taken to the enclosed pranced, glass-front benefactor balcony that hovered directly over the main stage. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped into a completely different world. The donor suite was pristine. There were catered refreshments, comfortable leather seating, and an unobstructed, panoramic view of the entire football field. I was the only person in the suite. The university dean had specifically reserved it for me, honoring the massive, anonymous trust fund that was currently paying the salaries of half the engineering faculty. I poured myself a glass of iced water with lemon, walked over to the thick glass railing, and looked down at the field below. It did not take me long to find them. The general VIP section was located right on the grass, just a few yards in front of the stage, and there she was, Eleanor. She was wearing a bright, the floral silk dress that looked entirely too tight and oversized designer sunglasses that covered half her face. She was practically vibrating with nervous, arrogant energy. She was sitting in the very center of the front row, wedged directly between my son David and Arthur Vance. I stood in the cool air conditioning of my private balcony and watched her work the room. She was leaning over, whispering to Arthur, pointing toward the stage, laughing a little too loudly at whatever he was saying. She was playing the part of the sophisticated, wealthy matriarch to absolute perfection. David looked completely miserable. He was staring straight ahead, his shoulders slumped, sweating under the intense morning sun. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. But Eleanor was in absolute heaven. She was sitting in the best seat in the house, rubbing elbows with corporate power, completely and entirely convinced that she had successfully eliminated her embarrassing mother-in-law from the equation. She truly believed she had won. She thought her flimsy lie had worked perfectly. She thought she was the smartest person in that stadium, pulling the strings of everyone around her to secure the promotion that would save her from financial ruin. She had absolutely no idea that she was sitting on a trap door. She had no idea that the mother-in-law she had just uninvited was currently standing 30 feet above her head, looking down at her like a bad investment that was about to be liquidated. Suddenly, the massive stadium speakers crackled to life. The university marching band began to play the traditional processional march. The heavy brass instruments echoed across the field as the long line of graduates in their black gowns started filing into the stadium. I set my water glass down on a small cocktail table. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal gray suit. The waiting was over. The false triumph had reached its absolute peak. The ceremony was beginning, and the market was finally about to correct itself. The marching band played their triumphant song. The students filed into the stadium, hundreds of young men and women in heavy black gowns walking in perfectly straight lines across the bright green turf. I stood at the thick glass window of my private suite and watched my grandson. Leo was in the middle of the pack, walking with his head held high. But as he got closer to the seating area, I saw his eyes begin to frantically scan the crowd. He was looking down at the VIP section on the grass. He was looking for me. I watched him find his parents. I watched him see his mother, his father, and the older man in a very expensive suit sitting in the fourth chair, the chair that was supposed to be mine, even from 30 feet in the air. Behind heavy, soundproof glass, I could see the exact moment my grandson's heart broke. His shoulders dropped completely. The proud, bright smile vanished from his face. He realized his mother had lied to him. And he realized he was entirely powerless to do anything about it. I placed my hand flat against the cool glass. I wanted to tap on the window. I wanted to wave down at him and tell him I was right here. But I did not. I kept my hands still. In my line of work, I learned a very difficult lesson. Sometimes, to properly fix a completely broken foundation, you have to let the walls crack all the way to the ceiling so everyone can see exactly where the rot is. I shifted my gaze to Eleanor. You would think a mother, watching her only child graduate at the top of his class, would be overcome with emotion. You would think she would be holding a camera or wiping away a tear, or at least looking at him. She was not doing any of those things. She was completely turned sideways in her folding chair, talking aggressively into Arthur Vance's ear. She was pointing at the massive stage, pointing at the impressive architecture of the stadium, desperately trying to associate herself with the wealth and prestige of the university. She was fanning herself with a glossy graduation program, her heavily powdered face starting to melt under the brutal 90-degree sun. Arthur Vance did not look impressed. He looked exactly like a senior corporate executive who had been dragged out of his air-conditioned office on a Sunday afternoon to sit on a hot football field. He was checking his watch. He was nodding politely. But his body language was completely closed off. He was enduring Eleanor, not enjoying her. David sat on the other side of her, staring straight ahead like a statue. He was sweating completely through his cheap suit. He looked absolutely miserable. He was watching his wife use their son's greatest achievement as a cheap networking gimmick. And he was saying absolutely nothing. The contrast was almost poetic. Down there on the grass, they were sweltering. They were suffocating under the weight of their own massive debt, their terrible lies, and their desperate need to impress a man who did not care about them at all. Up in the donor suite, the air was perfectly cool. I took another quiet sip of my iced water. I was entirely at peace. The students finally took their seats. The music faded out, and a heavy, expectant silence fell over the massive stadium. The university president walked up to the grand podium located in the center of the stage. He was a tall, distinguished man wearing heavy academic robes. He tapped the microphone, and his voice boomed out across the stadium speakers, echoing loudly off the concrete bleachers. He gave the standard opening remarks. He talked about the future. He talked about the challenges of the modern world and the incredible dedication of the graduating class. It was a beautiful speech. The kind of speech that makes you feel genuinely hopeful. I watched Eleanor through the glass. She was not listening. She was busy checking her cell phone, probably tracking the delivery status of the imported meat for her fake high society dinner party. Then, the president's tone shifted. He turned the page on his podium and looked out over the massive crowd. "Before we award the diplomas," he said, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "we have a few very special honors to present. As many of you know, this university is built on a foundation of incredible generosity. We rely on the quiet, steadfast support of visionary individuals who believe that exceptional talent should never be restricted by financial burden." The crowd went completely silent. Down in the VIP section, Eleanor suddenly sat up perfectly straight. She shoved her expensive cell phone into her designer handbag. I saw her reach over and tap Arthur Vance heavily on the arm, pointing excitedly toward the stage. This was it. This was the exact moment she had been waiting for all weekend. She knew Leo was the valedictorian of the engineering department. She knew he was about to be called up to the stage to be recognized for his prestigious, anonymous full-ride scholarship. She was literally vibrating with anticipation. She was preparing to bask in the reflected glory of her son's academic achievement, ready to use it as the final, glittering selling point to secure David's executive promotion. She looked so incredibly proud of a scholarship she had not contributed a single, solitary cent to. The president stepped closer to the microphone. "Today, we want to specifically recognize our top engineering graduate," he announced. "A young man who has demonstrated absolute brilliance and unparalleled work ethic over the last 4 years. But before we call him up to this stage, we must first acknowledge the extraordinary endowment that made his journey entirely possible." I set my water glass down on the small table. I stepped right up to the very edge of the glass window, looking directly down at my daughter-in-law. "For 4 years," the president continued, his voice ringing through the stadium, "this scholarship has been completely anonymous. The benefactor asked for no recognition. They asked for no public gratitude. They only asked that this brilliant young student be given the tools to succeed without the crushing weight of financial debt." Eleanor was smiling so wide, her face looked like it might actually break. She was nodding at Arthur Vance, silently taking credit for raising such a brilliant, worthy son. "However," the president said, his voice suddenly dropping into a serious, commanding register, "the terms of that anonymity have officially been lifted this morning." Down on the grass, Eleanor's smile froze. Just a little bit. A tiny, imperceptible flicker of confusion crossed her face. She tilted her head, clearly not understanding why the script she had built in her head was suddenly changing. The market was officially closing. The audit was complete. And it was time to read the final balance sheet out loud to the entire stadium. The university president adjusted his position at the heavy wooden podium. He looked out over the massive crowd, the sun catching the gold trim of his academic robes. The entire stadium was completely silent, waiting for the name of the mysterious benefactor who had funded the full-ride scholarship for their top engineering graduate. Down on the grass, Eleanor was practically glowing. She had her shoulders pulled back, her chin held high, waiting to bask in the reflected glory of her son's anonymous patron. She had just spent the last 20 minutes whispering into Arthur Vance's ear about how exclusive this program was, how brilliant her family was, and how perfectly they fit into the upper echelons of society. The president leaned into the microphone. "It is my distinct honor," he said, his voice echoing off the concrete bleachers, "to officially recognize the sole benefactor of this incredible gift. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the West Donor balcony and join me in thanking the founder of the Shirley Presley Educational Endowment." The name rolled over the stadium speakers like a physical shockwave. Shirley Presley. I stood perfectly still behind the thick glass window of the private suite. For about 3 seconds, absolutely nothing happened down in the VIP section. It was as if the sheer impossibility of the words had completely short-circuited Eleanor's brain. I watched her perfectly powdered face freeze. Her jaw actually dropped open, just a fraction of an inch. She blinked once, twice. She looked at David. Then she looked back at the stage, her mind desperately trying to reject the information it was receiving. Then, the massive digital screens that flanked the graduation stage flickered. The camera operators, completely aware of the script change, had already aimed their heavy lenses up at my private balcony. Suddenly, my face was projected on 2 screens that were 50 feet tall. I was not wearing a sensible wool cardigan. I was not sitting in a cheap folding chair, complaining about the heat. I was standing in a private, climate-controlled executive suite, wearing a tailored charcoal gray suit and a pearl necklace, looking down at the crowd with the absolute, unbothered calm of a retired investment banking director. The crowd erupted into a massive round of applause, thousands of people clapping, completely unaware of the absolute devastation happening in the front row of the VIP section. Down on the field, Leo practically jumped out of his seat. He spun around, completely ignoring the solemnity of the ceremony, and looked straight up at the west balcony. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the absolute shock, followed instantly by a wave of profound, overwhelming realization washing over his face. He put his hands over his mouth. He realized, in that exact moment, that his grandmother had not just bought him a vintage watch for graduation. She had bought him his entire future. I looked right at him, and I gave him a small, proud smile. I raised my hand and gave him a single, slight wave. Leo started crying. He did not care who saw him. He pointed up at the balcony, entirely ignoring his mother sitting just 10 feet away from him. And then I shifted my gaze to Eleanor. The false triumph was completely gone. The arrogant, high society facade she had spent the entire weekend building had just shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces right there on the hot stadium grass. She was staring up at the massive screens, her chest heaving, her hands trembling so violently that she actually dropped her oversized designer sunglasses onto the ground. She finally understood. She understood that the tired, simple widow she had constantly belittled was secretly holding a portfolio worth millions of dollars. She understood that she had just spent 4 years parading around in expensive university merchandise that was entirely funded by the very woman she had just uninvited from the ceremony. But the absolute best part of that moment, the part that truly signaled the beginning of her complete financial liquidation, was the reaction of Arthur Vance. Arthur was a senior corporate executive. He was a man who understood money, power, and leverage better than anyone else in that stadium. He did not get to the top of a logistics firm by being stupid. He looked up at the screen. He saw my name. He saw my tailored suit. He saw the private donor suite. And then he turned slowly and looked right at Eleanor. Even through the soundproof glass, I could read his body language perfectly. I had seen that exact same look in corporate boardrooms 100 times. It was the look a senior partner gives when they realize the person sitting next to them is a complete and absolute liability. Eleanor had spent the entire morning telling Arthur Vance that her mother-in-law was a fragile, confused old woman who was simply too weak to attend the ceremony. She had fed him a massive 25ers. Pathetic lie about a ticketing error just to get him into that seat. Arthur was doing the math. He was putting the pieces together. If Eleanor was willing to lie so easily about the woman funding a multi-million-dollar endowment just to secure a networking opportunity, what else was she lying about? I watched Arthur lean over. He did not look amused. He did not look impressed. He spoke a few very short, very sharp words to David. David looked like he was about to pass out. The blood had completely drained from his face. He looked up at my balcony, his eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and utter shame. He finally realized that his choice to remain silent, his choice to enable his wife's terrible behavior, had just cost him everything. He had traded his mother for a promotion, and now, the man holding that promotion had just realized his entire family was a fraudulent investment. The applause slowly died down. The president called Leo's name. My grandson walked up the steps to the main stage. He walked with his head held high, his shoulders squared. When the president handed him his diploma, Leo did not look out at the VIP section. He did not look at the empty corporate suit sitting in his grandmother's chair. He looked straight up at the west balcony, holding the heavy leather binder right over his heart. I stayed at the window for the rest of the ceremony. I watched every single student cross that stage. I enjoyed my iced water. I enjoyed the air conditioning. I watched Eleanor sit completely frozen in her folding chair for the next 2 hours. She did not speak to Arthur again. Arthur moved his chair a few inches away from her, creating a very clear, very deliberate physical boundary. The networking event was over. The corporate merger had completely failed. She was sitting in the best seat in the house, surrounded by the high society she had desperately tried to buy her way into, and she had never looked more completely and utterly bankrupt. When the final student crossed the stage and the traditional toss of the graduation caps filled the air, the stadium erupted into absolute chaos. Thousands of people stood up, cheering, hugging, and moving toward the field to find their children. It was a massive, joyful wave of humanity. But I was not watching the crowd. I was watching my grandson, down on the grass. Leo did not wait for the recessional music to finish. He did not turn to the VIP section to take pictures with his mother. He handed his graduation cap to a friend standing next to him, broke out of the student line, and started walking with absolute, singular purpose toward the west side of the stadium. I turned away from the heavy glass window and waited by the door of the private donor suite. It took him about 10 minutes to navigate through the massive crowd and get past the university security guards. When the heavy oak door of my suite finally swung open, Leo was standing there, breathing hard. His black graduation gown completely wrinkled. He looked at the catered food on the table. He looked at the leather chairs. And then he looked at me. He did not say a word. He just walked across the room and wrapped his arms around me in a crushing hug. He is a tall boy, much taller than his father. But in that moment, he felt exactly like the little kid who used to sit on my back porch and help me fix broken radios. He was holding on to me so tightly I could actually feel him shaking. He was crying, burying his face into the shoulder of my charcoal gray suit. "You did this," he finally whispered, his voice completely broken with emotion. "4 years. Grandma, every single book, every single meal. It was you the entire time." I reached up and patted his back, smoothing down the heavy fabric of his gown. "I did not do the work, Leo," I told him quietly. "You pulled the late nights in the library. You passed the advanced calculus exams. You earned the valedictorian spot entirely, on your own merit. I just made sure nobody placed a heavy financial weight around your ankles before you even learned how to run." He pulled back and looked at me. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked incredibly exhausted. But for the first time all weekend, he also looked completely free. The heavy, suffocating pressure his mother had placed on him was entirely gone. He knew exactly who was standing in his corner. And he knew it had absolutely nothing to do with high society aesthetics or corporate networking. We walked over to the glass window together and looked down at the field. The crowd had thinned out significantly, but the VIP section was still mostly intact. And right there in the front row, a completely silent, absolutely devastating corporate execution was taking place. In the financial world, when a massive deal goes completely sour, you do not linger. You do not stand around and make small talk. You cut your losses. You pack your briefcase. And you walk right out of the room. That is exactly what Arthur Vance was doing. I watched the senior managing partner stand up from his folding chair. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand to David. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket with a very slow, very deliberate motion that communicated absolute, unassailable finality. Eleanor was standing next to him, frantically talking, waving her hands, completely panicked. She was pointing toward the parking lot, probably reminding him about the lavish, private dinner party waiting for him at her house. Arthur did not even look at her. He looked at David. He spoke exactly one sentence. I could not hear the words, but I saw the way David physically recoiled, as if he had actually been struck in the chest. And then, Arthur Vance turned his back on them and walked away. He walked through the crowd, heading straight for the stadium exit, entirely deleting the Presley family from his professional life. David was left standing perfectly still on the hot turf. He was staring at the empty space where his career had just been standing. He realized, in that exact moment, that he had sacrificed his own dignity, alienated his son, and allowed his mother to be humiliated, all for a promotion that was now permanently and irreversibly dead. Eleanor just stood there, her mouth hanging open. She looked down at her expensive floral dress. She looked at her quilted designer handbag sitting on the empty folding chair that was supposed to be mine. The false triumph was completely over. The market had corrected itself, and she had just lost everything. "Grandma," Leo said softly, standing next to me at the window. "Mom has a private chef waiting at the house right now. She ordered 3 dozen imported orchids. She has a 5-course meal prepared for Mr. Vance." I looked at my grandson, and I gave him a small, very calm smile. "Well," I said smoothly, "I suppose she is going to have to eat a lot of expensive leftovers this week." Leo actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound of pure disbelief and absolute relief. "Are we going to the dinner party?" he asked, looking back down at the field where his parents were now arguing frantically. Absolutely not, I replied. I know a very quiet little diner about 10 miles from here. They make a fantastic cherry pie. I think we should go celebrate your graduation in peace. Just the two of us. Let your parents handle their own investments. We left the stadium through the private underground exit, completely bypassing the chaotic crowds and the miserable scene on the football field. I drove us to the diner in my 10-year-old sedan. We sat in a red vinyl booth for 3 solid hours. We ate hamburgers and pie, and we talked about his future job interviews. We did not talk about Eleanor. We did not talk about the massive debt waiting for her at home. I let Eleanor have her Sunday evening. I let her go back to a heavily mortgaged house filled with imported flowers and catered food she could not afford to pay for. I let her sit in the suffocating silence of a ruined networking event, blaming everyone but herself for the disaster. I let her sit in the dark and wonder how she was going to pay the minimum balances on her maxed-out credit cards without David's promotion. She thought the graduation ceremony was the worst thing that could possibly happen to her. She thought the public humiliation of the endowment announcement was the absolute bottom of the barrel. She had absolutely no idea that I was just getting started. Sunday was just the public correction. Monday morning was when the real liquidation was going to begin. Monday morning arrived exactly the same way Sunday did for me. It was quiet. The sun came up. The birds started singing in my garden. And I sat at my small kitchen table with a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea. In the financial sector, Monday morning is when the reality of the weekend finally hits the ledger. If a company made a terrible mistake on Friday afternoon, Monday is when the market opens and the stock price absolutely plummets. I spent 35 years watching arrogant executives walk into their glass offices on a Monday morning, entirely unaware that their access badges had already been deactivated. At exactly 9 o'clock, my phone rang. I picked it up on the first ring. "Good morning?" "Marcus." I said, "Good morning." "Shirley," he replied. His voice was perfectly crisp, entirely devoid of any emotion. "I am calling to confirm that the liquidation protocol has been officially initiated at 8:30 this morning. My office filed the formal withdrawal of your status as the legacy guarantor on David and Eleanor's primary mortgage." I took a slow sip of my tea. "And the bank?" I asked. "The bank reacted exactly as we anticipated," Marcus said. "When you remove a high-net-worth guarantor from a heavily over-leveraged asset, you do not get a polite phone call asking if everything is okay. You trigger an automated insolvency protocol. The bank's risk assessment algorithms immediately scanned their current debt-to-income ratio. They saw the maxed-out credit cards, the missed car payments, and the massive home equity line of credit." He paused, and I could hear the faint sound of him turning a page in a physical file. "The system identified them as a critical default risk," he continued. "To protect their own capital, the primary lender has initiated a complete asset freeze. Their joint checking accounts, their savings, and their home equity line are entirely locked down, pending a mandatory financial review. The credit card companies were automatically notified of the status change. Every single card with a flexible limit has been suspended. It was a perfectly executed corporate strike. It was clean, it was legal, and it was absolutely devastating. "Thank you, Marcus," I said quietly. "Let me know when they try to contact you." "Oh, they will try," he replied smoothly. "But my office does not take calls from insolvent liabilities. Have a wonderful Monday." "Shirley." I hung up the phone and looked out my window. I could easily imagine exactly what was happening across town at that very moment. Eleanor had probably woken up late, entirely exhausted from the absolute disaster of her Sunday night. I imagine her expensive house smelled like stale wine and the fading scent of 3 dozen imported white orchids. She had hosted a 5-course meal prepared by a private chef, all for a corporate executive who had literally walked away from her family in the middle of a football stadium. The networking event had failed completely. The promotion was entirely dead. But the bills for that illusion were still very much alive. Private event planners and independent caterers do not work on credit. They require the final balance to be paid the morning after the event. I pictured Eleanor standing in her kitchen, wearing a silk robe, aggressively tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the marble counter as the private chef handed her the final invoice. She would have offered her signature fake, sugary smile. She would have pulled her expensive designer wallet out of her quilted leather handbag and handed him a premium credit card. And then, she would have watched the small digital screen on his payment terminal light up with a single, terrifying word. Declined. She would have laughed it off. Of course, she would have blamed the bank's fraud detection system, claiming that her extravagant weekend spending had simply triggered a false alarm. She would have reached into her wallet and pulled out a different card, a gold one, a platinum one. Declined. Declined. That is the exact moment the cold, heavy realization would have finally hit her stomach. The absolute panic of a woman who realizes the floor has entirely vanished beneath her feet. She would have logged into her banking app on her phone, expecting to see her available balances. Instead, she would have seen bright red error messages. Account suspended. Contact your branch administrator immediately. In my entire career, I have learned that people like Eleanor do not immediately accept defeat. Their egos are simply too massive. They believe there has been a mistake. They believe they can yell at a customer service representative and demand that their accounts be reinstated because they are important. Wealthy people. She would have called the bank, absolutely furious, demanding to speak to a manager. And that manager, sitting in a cubicle somewhere, looking at his computer screen, would have told her the absolute, unvarnished truth. He would have told her that the legacy guarantor, Mrs. Shirley Presley, had officially completely withdrawn her financial backing. He would have explained that because the property was entirely underwater and their consumer debt exceeded their income, the bank was legally required to freeze the assets to prevent capital flight. She had spent the entire weekend trying to erase my name from a piece of paper so she could impress a stranger. And on Monday morning, she woke up to find out that my name was the only thing keeping a roof over her head. David was probably sitting in his car in the parking lot of his corporate logistics firm when he found out. He would have received the automated text messages from his credit card companies. He would have seen the alerts popping up on his phone one after another. A rapid-fire sequence of complete financial ruin. He had gone into work knowing he had to face Arthur Vance. He knew he had to walk into the office of a man who now viewed him as a complete liability. And right before he walked through those glass doors, his phone would have told him that he could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee in the lobby downstairs. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I finished my tea, washed my cup in the sink, and walked into my living room. I picked up a good book, sat down in my favorite chair, and started reading. I was not going to call them. I was not going to drive over to their house and gloat. I was simply going to sit in my paid-off home, perfectly insulated from the storm, and let the sheer weight of their own terrible decisions pull them completely under. The market was correcting itself, and I had a front-row seat to the crash. I did not have to wait very long for the absolute reality of the situation to reach my front porch. It was just past 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the window, reading a very good biography, enjoying the quiet hum of my air conditioning. Outside, the neighborhood was perfectly still, And then, the silence was shattered by the sound of tires screeching onto the concrete of my driveway. I looked up from my book and glanced out the window. It was not the least luxury SUV. That car was probably already sitting in a bank impound lot somewhere. Or hiding in a closed garage to avoid the repo man. It was David's older commuter car. The one he usually kept hidden because Eleanor thought it was too ugly to be parked in their expensive driveway. The car doors slammed with incredible force. I watched my son and my daughter-in-law march up my front walkway, and the physical transformation in both of them was absolutely staggering. Just 24 hours earlier, Eleanor had been sitting in the absolute center of the VIP section, wearing a tight floral silk dress, hiding behind oversized designer sunglasses, radiating pure, unadulterated arrogance. Now, she looked entirely unhinged. She was wearing a pair of wrinkled sweatpants and a baggy sweater. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot. She did not look like a high society matriarch preparing to host a private chef. She looked exactly like a woman who had just realized her credit cards were completely worthless. Pieces of plastic. David looked even worse. He was still wearing his corporate work trousers and a wrinkled dress shirt, but he had pulled his tie off completely. His face was a pale, sickly shade of gray. He looked like a man who had not slept, eaten, or taken a full breath in days. They did not ring the doorbell. Eleanor balled her hand into a fist and started pounding aggressively on my heavy wooden front door. I did not rush. I took a moment to place a small paper bookmark on my page. I closed the book, set it gently on the side table, and stood up. I smoothed down the front of my slacks, walked slowly into the entryway, and unlocked the deadbolt. When I pulled the door open, Eleanor practically tried to shove her way inside, but I stood perfectly still, blocking the threshold. I did not invite them in. "What did you do?" Eleanor screamed, her voice completely hysterical. Cracking on the very last syllable, her face was flushed, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of absolute fury and sheer, undeniable panic. "What did you do to my accounts?" "Shirley." I looked at her. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her chaotic energy. I just stared at her with the exact same cold, professional expression I used to give to junior analysts when they made a catastrophic error on a quarterly report. "I did not do anything to your accounts." "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I have absolutely zero access to your money. I simply called my lawyer and requested that my name be permanently removed as the legacy guarantor on your primary mortgage. It was a standard administrative update, nothing more." She let out a harsh, wildly inappropriate laugh. "An administrative update." She shrieked, waving her hands in the air. The bank froze everything. They locked the checking accounts. They suspended the home equity line. I had 3 caterers standing in my kitchen this morning, demanding payment for the dinner party. And every single one of my cards declined. I was humiliated. Do you understand me? I had to beg the private chef not to call the police for theft of services. "You ruined my life." I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms. "You ruined your own life." "Eleanor," I told her quietly, "you spent 10 years living in a house you could not afford, driving cars you did not own, and buying things you did not need just to impress people who do not care about you. You built an entire empire of debt. And you used my spotless credit history to hold it up. I just decided I was tired of carrying the weight of your illusions." She opened her mouth to scream something else. But David finally stepped forward. He reached out and grabbed his wife by the arm, pulling her back just a fraction of an inch. "Mom, please," David begged. his voice trembling so badly he could barely get the words out. "You have to call Marcus. You have to tell the bank to reverse this if you do not reinstate your guarantor status by tomorrow morning. They are going to initiate foreclosure proceedings. We have absolutely no cash." Arthur pulled me into his office at 9 o'clock this morning. He did not just deny my promotion. He took me off the primary logistics account. The massive executive bonus we were counting on is completely gone. We are going to lose the house. Mom, we are going to lose everything. I looked at my son. He was 42 years old, a senior manager in a major corporation, and he was standing on my porch, crying, begging his retired mother to bail him out of a disaster he had entirely created himself. I felt a profound, heavy sadness in my chest. Not for the money, not for the house, but for the man he had chosen to become. "You traded your own integrity for that promotion, David," I said, my voice dropping into a low, devastating whisper. "You sat at your expensive dining table and listened to your wife tell me to hide my simple hobbies so I would not embarrass you. You stood in that stadium and watched her give my rightful seat to your boss. All so you could play the part of a wealthy executive catters. You chose her lies over my loyalty." David looked down at his shoes. He could not even look me in the eye. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew it was entirely unforgivable. But Eleanor was not capable of self-reflection. When a fraudster is backed into a corner and realizes the money is truly gone, they resort to the absolute lowest form of emotional blackmail. "If you do not fix this right now..." "Surely," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger an inch from my face. "You are never going to see Leo again. I will make sure he knows exactly what you did to his family. I will tell him you maliciously bankrupted his parents on the week of his graduation. He will hate you for the rest of his life." I did not flinch. I did not back down. I just gave her a very small, very cold smile. "That is incredibly interesting, Eleanor," I said smoothly, "because Leo and I had a wonderful dinner together last night at that little diner on the edge of town. We ate cherry pie and talked about his future for 3 hours. He knows exactly who funded his endowment. He knows exactly why his ticket was suddenly unavailable yesterday morning. And he knows exactly how much debt you are in." I watched the color completely drain out of Eleanor's face. The ultimate weapon she thought she possessed, the control over her son, had already been completely neutralized. "He is an adult now," I continued, my voice sharp and final. "He has his degree. He has no debt. And thanks to your absolute incompetence this weekend, he finally has total clarity about who his mother really is. You have absolutely nothing left to leverage. Eleanor, the market is closed." I stepped back inside my house and placed my hand on the edge of the heavy wooden door. "I highly suggest you go home and start packing your expensive imported flowers into boxes," I told them quietly, "because the bank does not care about your aesthetic." I closed the door in their faces and locked the deadbolt with a loud, absolute click. In my line of work, we had a saying about massive financial collapses. The explosion on Monday is entirely expected. It is loud. It is chaotic. And it makes all the headlines. But the real devastation does not happen during the explosion. The real devastation happens on Tuesday, when the dust finally settles, and the people who were standing too close to the blast radius realize they are covered in ash. Tuesday morning brought a very different kind of silence to my house. It was not the quiet anticipation of the weekend. It was the absolute, heavy stillness of a closed market. I was sitting in my living room, sorting through some gardening catalogs, when a heavy black town car pulled into my driveway. It was not a taxi. It was a private, hired car. The driver got out, walked around to the back, and opened the passenger door. Out stepped Beatrice. Beatrice was Eleanor's mother. If you ever wanted to know exactly how Eleanor became a woman who would leverage her own family into absolute bankruptcy just to buy a designer handbag, all you had to do was look at Beatrice. She was the original architect of the illusion. She was a woman who lived on a very modest fixed pension, but spent every waking moment pretending she was old money. She was the one who had sat in the VIP section on Sunday, nodding approvingly at Arthur Vance, completely oblivious to the fact that she was sitting on a ticking financial time bomb. I watched her walk up my front path. She was wearing a heavy tweed suit that was entirely inappropriate for the summer heat. A string of oversized pearls and enough floral perfume to choke a horse. She walked with a stiff, artificial dignity, like a queen descending upon a rebellious province. I opened the front door before she even had a chance to knock. "Good morning, Beatrice," I said smoothly. She did not smile. She did not offer a polite greeting. She simply walked past me, stepping into my entryway and looking around my modest, comfortable living room with an expression of profound distaste. "We need to have a very serious conversation." "Surely," she announced, her voice trembling with a mixture of forced authority and barely concealed panic. I closed the front door. I did not ask her to sit down. I did not offer her a cup of tea. I simply folded my hands in front of me and waited. "Eleanor called me last night," Beatrice continued, turning to face me. She was absolutely hysterical. "She told me what you did to their accounts. She told me you maliciously called the bank and froze their assets right in the middle of a temporary cash flow issue." I raised a single eyebrow. "A temporary cash flow issue," I repeated quietly. "Yes," Beatrice snapped, lifting her chin. "A minor discrepancy. The kind of thing that families handle privately. But you decided to throw a temper tantrum over a simple seating arrangement at a graduation ceremony. You felt slighted. So you decided to humiliate my daughter and ruin her husband's career. It is petty. Surely, it is incredibly common. And it is completely unacceptable behavior for a woman of your age." I looked at Beatrice. I looked at her fake pearls. I looked at the slight tremor in her hands, clutching her outdated leather purse. She was trying to play the etiquette card. She was trying to make me feel uncultured and vindictive, hoping I would back down out of sheer social embarrassment. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my actions. I simply let her finish her little speech. "Beatrice," I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice water, "your daughter does not have a temporary cash flow issue. Your daughter has a $300,000 home equity deficit, 6 maxed-out credit cards, and 2 leased vehicles that are currently 30 days past due. She is operating a domestic Ponzi scheme, and she was using my pristine credit history to keep the police from knocking on her door." Beatrice actually took a physical step backward. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Eleanor clearly had not told her the actual numbers. Eleanor had probably spun a lie about a minor bank error or a vindictive mother-in-law, entirely shielding her mother from the catastrophic reality of their debt. I stepped closer to her. I did not break eye contact. I did not freeze their accounts out of spite. I told her quietly, "I froze them because I am a retired investment banking director, and I know exactly what a toxic asset looks like. I removed my name from their mortgage to protect my own capital. The bank's risk assessment algorithms did the rest. If you want to be angry at someone for the foreclosure notices your daughter is going to receive by Friday, you should be angry at the woman who taught her that a luxury vehicle was more important than a solid foundation." Beatrice's face flushed a deep, angry red. her facade of high society calmness completely shattered. "You listen to me." "Surely," she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You are going to call your lawyer right now. You are going to reinstate your guarantor status. And you are going to fix this. If you do not, I will make sure everyone in our social circle knows exactly what you did. I will tell the entire country club. I will ruin your reputation in this town. You will be completely ostracized." I stared at her for a long, quiet moment. And then I actually laughed. It was a soft, genuine sound of absolute amusement. "My reputation?" I asked. I walked over to my side table and picked up my cup of tea. "Beatrice," I said, taking a slow sip, "I spent 35 years managing the private portfolios of the wealthiest families in this state. The people who actually own the country club your daughter was desperately trying to impress? I used to approve their commercial bridge loans. They do not care about a seating chart at a graduation. But they do care very deeply about financial fraud." I set the cup down. The ceramic clinked sharply against the saucer. "If you want to go air your daughter's dirty laundry," I continued, my voice dropping into a deadly, unyielding whisper. "If you want to tell everyone that Eleanor Presley is entirely insolvent and living on borrowed money, you are more than welcome to do so. It will save the bank the trouble of publishing the foreclosure notice in the local paper." Beatrice stared at me. The sheer, unassailable reality of the situation finally pierced through her thick layer of generational delusion. She realized she had absolutely no leverage. She could not bully me. She could not guilt-trip me. And she certainly could not threaten a woman who held more quiet power in her little finger than Beatrice's entire fake social circle combined. She did not say another word. She turned around, her shoulders completely slumped, and walked out my front door. She looked small. She looked exactly like an old woman who had just realized the curtain had fallen on a play she had been acting in her entire life. I watched her get back into her hired town car. I watched the car back out of my driveway and disappear down the street. The enablers always fall apart exactly the same way the primary fraudsters do. They cannot handle the bright, harsh light of a full audit. I locked my front door and went back to my gardening catalogs. The market was completely closed, and the Presley family's line of credit was officially and permanently dead. By Wednesday morning, exactly 48 hours after the bank officially froze their accounts, the absolute reality of the situation had completely settled into the foundation of my son's house. The initial explosion of Monday was over. The desperate, angry threats of Tuesday had entirely failed. Wednesday was the day the heavy Triders Avenue's year. Suffocating silence of total ruin finally moved in. I was in my kitchen, slicing some fresh fruit for my morning breakfast, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. It was not a leased luxury vehicle. It was not a hired town car. It was Leo's beat-up 10-year-old compact car. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the front door. When I opened it, I saw my grandson standing on the porch. He was carrying 2 heavy canvas duffel bags, and his backpack was slung over one shoulder. He looked incredibly tired. But the heavy, nervous tension that usually sat behind his eyes was completely gone. "Hi, Grandma," he said softly, dropping the heavy bags onto the porch. "Do you still have that spare bedroom available?" I did not ask any questions. I just smiled, pushed the front door wide open, and told him he could stay for as long as he needed. I helped him carry his bags down the hall. We left them in the spare room, and I guided him back to the kitchen. I poured him a large glass of orange juice and set a plate of breakfast in front of him. He sat at my small wooden table, staring down at his food for a long moment before he finally spoke. I could not stay there another minute. "Grandma," he said, his voice entirely drained of emotion. The house is completely toxic. It is like breathing in poison. I sat down across from him and took a slow sip of my tea. Tell me what happened. Leo, I said quietly. He let out a long, heavy sigh and leaned back in his chair. He told me that after the disastrous Sunday ceremony and the bank freeze on Monday, the entire dynamic of the household had completely shattered. David and Eleanor were no longer a team united by their high society ambitions. They had turned into two drowning people, aggressively trying to push the other one under the water just to get a single breath of air. But last night was the breaking point, Leo said, shaking his head slowly. Around 9 o'clock, a heavy commercial tow truck pulled into the driveway. I set my teacup down. The leasing company? I asked. Leo nodded. He told me the repo men did not even knock on the front door. They just backed the heavy truck right up to David's leased luxury SUV, hooked the chains under the front axle, and started hoisting it up. The sound of the grinding metal and the loud diesel engine echoed through the entire gated community. Eleanor completely lost her mind. Leo continued, looking up at me. She ran out the front door in her silk pajamas, screaming at the tow truck driver. She was demanding that he put the car down, telling him that there was a massive bank error and that they were important corporate executives. She actually tried to stand between the truck and the street. I pictured the scene perfectly in my mind. Eleanor, the woman who had spent 10 years desperately trying to project an image of untouchable wealth, having a complete public meltdown on her perfectly manicured lawn, while a repo man took away her husband's car. The worst part was the neighbors, Leo said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You know how Mom was always bragging to the people across the street? She was always judging their landscaping or their clothes. Well, every single porch light on the block turned on. People came out of their front doors. They just stood on their lawns and watched her scream. They saw the whole thing. The illusion is completely dead. Grandma, everyone in that neighborhood knows they are broke. I looked at my grandson. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for Eleanor. She had built a massive, fragile glass house, and she had spent years throwing stones at everyone around her. She had finally shattered her own windows, and now she had to sweep up the glass in front of an audience. And your father? I asked gently. What did David do while this was happening? Leo looked down at his glass of juice. He did nothing, he replied. He just stood in the doorway and watched. He did not go out to help Mom. He did not try to talk to the driver. He just looked completely defeated. Leo took a slow breath before continuing. Dad did not even go to work yesterday, he told me. After Arthur Vance walked away from him at the graduation, things got incredibly bad at the firm. Dad told Mom that Human Resources called him into a meeting on Tuesday morning because his personal bank accounts were flagged for critical insolvency. The corporate accounting department had to suspend his company credit cards. Arthur officially removed him from the senior partnership track. They are keeping him on as a mid-level manager for now. But his massive year-end bonus is completely gone. The math was absolutely unforgiving. Without that executive bonus, David could not even cover the minimum payments on their massive mountain of consumer debt, let alone the $300,000 home equity line. They were screaming at each other all night. Leo said, rubbing his eyes. Mom was blaming Dad for not securing the promotion. Dad was blaming Mom for maxing out the credit cards and lying to Arthur Vance about the graduation tickets. They are just tearing each other apart. So, I packed my bags before the sun even came up. I am done. I have my degree. I have 3 job interviews lined up next week. I am going to start my own life, and I am not going to let them drag me down with them. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. My hand was warm and steady. You are making the absolute smartest decision of your life. Leo. I told him. You cannot save people who refuse to admit they are sinking. You have a brilliant future ahead of you. And it belongs entirely to you, not to them. We finished our breakfast in comfortable, profound silence. The chaotic, toxic energy of his parents' house was miles away. Leo moved his things into the spare bedroom, set up his computer on the small desk, and immediately started preparing for his upcoming engineering interviews. I went out to my backyard and started watering my tomato plants. The massive, terrifying storm I had unleashed upon my son and my daughter-in-law was entirely out of my hands now. I did not need to make any more phone calls. I did not need to confront them again. The bank, the creditors, and the brutal reality of the corporate world were doing all the heavy lifting for me. Eleanor had wanted to play a high-stakes game of wealth and power. She had wanted to sit at the absolute top of the social ladder. Now, the ladder had completely snapped, and she was in a free fall, entirely unable to grasp exactly how far the bottom really was. And the foreclosure notice had not even arrived in her mailbox yet. Thursday morning was a day of absolute contrasts. Inside my house, there was nothing but bright, quiet hope. Leo woke up early, put on a simple button-down shirt, and did his first virtual job interview from the small desk in my spare bedroom. By noon, he walked into the kitchen with a massive smile on his face. He had received a preliminary offer, an entry-level engineering position at a very solid, very respectable firm. It was not a multi-million-dollar executive role, but it was real. It was honest money. We celebrated with sandwiches and iced tea. While we were eating, my phone rang. It was Marcus. He told me that the bank had officially moved past the automated freeze. They had initiated the formal default and foreclosure process at exactly 10 o'clock that morning. A legal courier walked up the perfectly manicured walkway of David and Eleanor's house and taped a bright yellow notice of default directly to their heavy oak front door. In a gated community, you cannot hide a bright yellow piece of paper taped to your front door. It is the ultimate, undeniable flag of financial surrender. Everyone driving by, every neighbor walking their dog, could see exactly what it meant. About 2 hours later, Leo's cell phone rang. He looked at the screen, and his smile completely vanished. It was his mother. He did not want to answer it, but I gave him a small nod. I told him he needed to hear whatever she had to say, so he could finally close the door on her completely. He put the phone on speaker and set it on the kitchen table. Leo. Sweetie. Eleanor's voice came through the speaker. She sounded frantic, completely untethered from reality. She was speaking entirely too fast. Thank God you answered. Listen to me. You need to come home right now. Your father left. He just packed a bag and walked out. He is having some kind of midlife crisis. But we can fix this. You just need to talk to your grandmother. Leo stared at the phone. He did not say a word. She is being completely unreasonable. Leo, Eleanor continued, her voice rising in pitch. The bank sent some horrible man to put a sticker on our door. It is so embarrassing. The neighbors are staring. You have to tell her to call her lawyer and undo this. Tell her I will apologize. Tell her whatever she wants to hear. Just get her to unfreeze the account so I can hire a lawyer and sue the bank for harassment. I sat quietly across the table. I watched my grandson listen to the woman who had used his entire college career as a networking prop. She was not calling to ask how he was doing. She was not calling to apologize for ruining his graduation. She was calling to use him as a human shield to protect her luxury lifestyle. Mom, Leo finally said, His voice was incredibly calm, incredibly steady. It sounded exactly like my voice when I used to sit in corporate boardrooms. "Yes, sweetie, I am here," she said quickly. "Tell her to fix it." "I am not going to tell her anything," Leo said. "Grandma did not ruin your life. You ruined your own life. You spent 4 years lying to me about my scholarship. You spent 10 years buying things you could not afford. You treated Dad like a prop. And you treated Grandma like an embarrassment. The bank is not harassing you. They are just finally collecting the debt you owe them." There was a sharp gasp on the other end of the line. "Leo, how can you say that to your own mother?" she cried, trying to pivot immediately into playing the victim. "I did everything for you. Everything I bought was to give this family a good image. A fake image." Leo corrected her quietly. "I do not care about your image. I just got a job offer today. A real job. I am going to make my own money. And I am going to pay my own bills. I am not coming back to that house. Mom? And I am not going to let you manipulate Grandma ever again. Do not call me to ask for money." He reached out and tapped the red button on the screen. The call disconnected. The kitchen was perfectly quiet again. Leo looked up at me. He took a deep breath, and his shoulders dropped. About 2 inches. The absolute, undeniable finality of that phone call had permanently severed the heavy chain she had kept wrapped around his neck for his entire life. "I am really proud of you, Leo," I told him softly. He smiled. A genuine, relaxed smile. "Thank you, Grandma." Later that afternoon, David finally called me. I answered it. He did not yell. He did not demand that I call the bank. His voice sounded completely hollow. It sounded like a man who had finally stopped trying to bail water out of a sinking boat and just let the ocean take him. He confirmed what Eleanor had told Leo. He had left her. He told me he was sitting in a cheap motel room out on the highway. He had packed a single duffel bag of clothes and left his keys on the kitchen counter. He told me he finally realized that Eleanor cared more about what the neighbors thought of that yellow paper on the door than she cared about the fact that their family was entirely bankrupt. "I do not have anything left." "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "My career is completely stalled. My credit is ruined. My son will not even look at me." He was waiting for me to save him. He was waiting for his mother to tell him he could come home, that I would open my checkbook, hire him a good lawyer, and fix the mess he had spent a decade making. I took a slow, deep breath. "David?" I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady. "I love you. I will always love you. But you are 42 years old. You chose to build your life on a foundation of lies because it was easier than standing up to a bully. I cannot fix this for you. If I bail you out now, you will never learn how to stand on your own 2 feet." There was a long silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of highway traffic in the background. "I know," he finally whispered. "You are right." I told him to call Leo when he was ready to actually be a father. Not an enabler. I told him to find a small apartment, to keep his head down at work, and to start paying off his debts $1 at a time. And then I hung up the phone. The market had completely corrected itself. The toxic assets had been entirely liquidated. The false partnerships were dissolved. Eleanor was now sitting completely alone in a massive, empty house that the bank owned, surrounded by imported orchids that were finally starting to rot. She had traded her family, her dignity, and her future for a temporary illusion of wealth. And now, the illusion was gone, and she had absolutely nothing left to show for it. In the financial sector, there is a very specific rhythm to a complete corporate collapse. Monday is the initial shock. Tuesday and Wednesday are the frantic, desperate attempts to secure emergency capital, but Friday is the day of absolute, undeniable reckoning. Friday afternoon is when the markets close for the weekend. And if you have not secured your funding by then, you are officially and completely dead in the water. Eleanor reached her Friday reckoning exactly 5 days after her disastrous performance at my grandson's graduation. I was sitting on my back porch, enjoying a perfectly quiet, warm Friday morning. Leo had already left the house. He had a second-round, in-person interview with the engineering firm, and he had walked out the front door looking sharp, confident, and entirely unburdened. I was drinking my second cup of tea, watching the early morning sunlight hit the leaves of my tomato plants. When my phone rang, it was Marcus. "Good morning, Shirley," he said. His voice was smooth, professional, but I could hear the faint, unmistakable trace of absolute amusement in his tone. "I thought you might want a final update before we close the files on the Presley accounts for the weekend." I set my teacup down on the small patio table. "Tell me." "Marcus," I said quietly, "it seems your daughter-in-law refused to accept the reality of her insolvency." Marcus began, "Yesterday afternoon. Instead of contacting a bankruptcy attorney like a rational person, she attempted to secure a private, high-yield bridge loan to pay off the immediate arrears on the mortgage and get the foreclosure notice removed from her front door." I raised a single eyebrow. "A private bridge loan," I repeated. "She has absolutely zero collateral. The house is completely underwater, and her credit is ruined. What legitimate lender would even take her call? She did not go to a legitimate lender." "Surely," Marcus replied. "She went to her country club." I sat back in my chair and listened as Marcus explained the absolute, spectacular finale of Eleanor's high society illusion. Eleanor had always desperately wanted to belong to the upper echelon of our city's social elite. The women she invited to her lavish tanned, fake dinner parties were the wives of incredibly wealthy developers, surgeons, and corporate owners. Eleanor believed that because she wore the same designer labels and drank the same expensive champagne, she was one of them. She believed they were her friends. So, in a state of absolute, blind desperation, Eleanor had approached a woman named Victoria. Victoria's husband owned one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the state. Eleanor invited Victoria to the country club for lunch on Thursday. According to the legal channels Marcus monitors, Eleanor spun a massive, elaborate lie. She told Victoria that David was in the middle of a highly confidential corporate buyout. She claimed their assets were temporarily frozen due to federal regulatory red tape regarding the merger. She asked Victoria for a personal loan of $50,000 just to cover their immediate liquidity issues for a few weeks. She promised to pay it back with massive interest the moment the imaginary merger was complete. She genuinely thought her fake aesthetic was enough to secure $50,000 in cash. What Eleanor failed to realize, Marcus continued, his voice dropping into a tone of clinical precision, is that people with real wealth do not write $50,000 checks based on a sad story and a designer handbag. Victoria's husband is a commercial developer. When someone asks him for money, he runs a title check. I closed my eyes for a brief second. I could see the absolute disaster unfolding with perfect, terrifying clarity. Victoria's husband had his legal team run a quiet, routine background check on David and Eleanor's primary residence. It took them exactly 10 minutes to pull the public county records. They did not find a pending corporate merger. They found a $300,000 home equity deficit. They found the massive consumer debt. And, most importantly, they found the bright yellow notice of default that the primary lender had filed earlier that week. They saw exactly what Eleanor was: a completely hollow, entirely insolvent liability. And Victoria did not keep that information to herself. Marcus said, "At the country club yesterday evening, Victoria sat in the main dining room and told every single person in their social circle exactly what Eleanor had tried to do. She told them about the foreclosure. She told them about the repossessed cars. The gossip spread through that club faster than a wildfire. I looked out at my quiet garden. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. But that is not the end of it. Surely," Marcus added smoothly. "The country club board of directors heard the rumors. They immediately audited Eleanor's membership account. It turns out she had not paid her monthly membership dues in over 90 days. They were about to suspend her anyway. But after the public embarrassment of her soliciting fraudulent loans from other members, they did not just suspend her. They formally expelled her. I let the weight of that information settle into the quiet morning air. When Eleanor arrived at the club this morning," Marcus concluded, "hoping to do damage control, the general manager stopped her in the lobby. He politely, but very firmly, asked her to hand over her membership card and escorted her off the property. She is completely exiled. The social market has officially liquidated her. Thank you for the update." "Marcus," I said softly, "I think we can officially consider this portfolio closed. Have a wonderful weekend." "Surely," he replied, and hung up the phone. I sat alone on my porch for a long time. I thought about Eleanor standing in the lavish, marble lobby of the country club she had sacrificed her entire family to join. I thought about the general manager holding out his hand, taking away the small plastic card that represented her entire false identity. I thought about her walking back out to the parking lot, having to call a cheap taxi because her luxury car had been towed away, entirely aware that every single wealthy woman sitting inside the dining room was watching her leave. She had spent 10 years treating me like a peasant because I wore a 10-year-old wool cardigan and drove a practical car. She had uninvited me from my only grandson's graduation because she thought my plain, quiet existence would shatter her illusion of high society dominance. And now, she had absolutely nothing. Her husband had left her. Her son had completely cut her off. Her house belonged to the bank, and the elite social circle she had worshipped had publicly and brutally thrown her out into the street. The tragic part was not that she lost her money. The tragic part was that without the money, without the leased cars and the designer handbags, she had absolutely no idea who she was anymore. She was just an empty, echoing shell. I picked up my teacup. The tea was getting cold, but it tasted absolutely perfect. I took a slow sip, stood up, and walked back inside my paid-off house to start preparing dinner for my grandson. The storm was completely over, and the air was finally clear. It took exactly 3 weeks for the bank to finalize the eviction process. 3 weeks for the massive, echoing house in the gated community to be completely hollowed out and reclaimed by the reality of the market. I did not go to see it happen. I had absolutely no desire to stand on the sidewalk and watch my daughter-in-law pack up her ruined life. But Leo needed to go back one last time. He needed to collect a few boxes of his childhood books and some winter clothes he had left in the attic before the bank officially changed the locks. He asked if I would drive over with him. He did not want me to help him carry things. He just wanted me to sit in the car so he would not have to face that house. Or his mother, entirely alone. We drove over on a Tuesday morning. The weather was bright and clear. As we turned into their expensive neighborhood, everything looked perfectly normal. The lawns were manicured. The sprinkler systems were running in perfect synchronization, and the large, quiet houses sat behind their perfectly trimmed hedges. But when we pulled up to David and Eleanor's address, the visual contrast was absolutely staggering. There was no luxury vehicle parked in the driveway. There was no private caterer unloading premium ingredients for a high society dinner party. Instead, there was a rusted, heavily dented moving van parked on the concrete. It was not a professional, high-end moving company. It was just a cheap, rented truck that charged by the hour. The kind you hire when you have absolutely no cash left to spare. I parked my 10-year-old sedan across the street, turned the engine off, and rolled down my window. I told Leo to take his time and that I would wait right there. Leo crossed the street, and I just sat in the quiet of my car and watched the house. Eleanor was standing on the front porch, and the physical degradation of her high society aesthetic was completely absolute. She was not wearing a tailored silk dress. She was not hiding behind oversized designer sunglasses. She was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt, cheap jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She was holding a plastic clipboard, arguing frantically with two men in heavy work boots who were carrying out the pieces of her expensive dining room table. I watched her point at a heavy crystal lamp, screaming at the men to be careful with it. The movers just ignored her, dragging the heavy boxes across the threshold without a single ounce of care. They knew she could not afford to tip them. And they were treating her belongings exactly the way the market treats a completely devalued asset. When Eleanor saw Leo walking up the driveway, I saw a sudden, desperate flash of hope light up her face. She dropped her clipboard and rushed down the concrete steps, opening her arms to hug him. She probably thought he had come to help her pack. She probably hoped he was going to offer her money from his new engineering job, or tell her he was going to let her move into his new apartment. Leo stopped walking. He did not step forward to meet her embrace. He did not raise his voice. And he did not cause a scene in front of the moving men. He simply shook his head, stepped around her, and walked through the open front door. Eleanor stood in the middle of the driveway, her arms hanging uselessly at her sides, completely rejected by the son she had tried to use as a networking prop. While Leo was inside, another vehicle pulled up behind the rented moving truck. It was a small, incredibly practical corporate sedan. A woman got out wearing a plain navy blazer and carrying a thick manila folder. She was a bank representative, sent to conduct the final property inspection and formally collect the keys. I watched the interaction from across the street. The bank representative did not care about Eleanor's country club connections. She did not care about the imported orchids that were now completely dead and sitting in black garbage bags on the curb. She simply walked up to the porch, held out her clipboard, and asked for a signature. Eleanor hesitated. She looked at the heavy oak front door. She looked at the perfectly manicured lawn she had spent 10 years pretending she actually owned. And then, with trembling hands, she picked up a cheap plastic pen and signed her name on the foreclosure document, officially handing over her entire illusion to the primary lender. A few minutes later, Leo came out of the house carrying 2 heavy cardboard boxes. He walked straight past his mother without saying a single word, crossed the street, and put the boxes in the trunk of my car. When he got into the passenger seat, he let out a very long, very heavy sigh. I asked him how it looked inside. He told me the house was completely empty and entirely depressing. The walls were covered in faded, dusty squares where expensive paintings used to hang. The carpets were badly stained. Without the lavish furniture and the fancy lighting, he said it just looked like a hollow, echoing shell, exactly like the woman who used to live in it. He also told me that his mother had begged him for $300 right before he walked out the door. She claimed she needed it to pay the movers their final hourly rate. Leo had looked at the brand new, incredibly expensive smartphone she was still clutching in her hand, the one luxury item she absolutely refused to sell. And he told her no. He told her she needed to learn how to budget her own money. It was a brutally harsh lesson for a son to teach his mother. But it was the most important thing he could have ever done for her. He was finally breaking the cycle. He was absolutely refusing to be her financial enabler. As I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, I thought about what Marcus had told me earlier that week. With her credit entirely ruined and her social circle completely closed off, Eleanor could not rent an apartment in any decent part of the city. No landlord would ever touch a woman with a fresh foreclosure, 6 maxed-out credit cards, and 0 income. She was moving into a tiny, one-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex on the far industrial side of town, a place where the paint was peeling, the parking lot was cracked, and absolutely nobody cared about designer logos. David was not doing much better, but he had finally taken a single step in the right direction. He had called me the night before to tell me he had officially filed the legal paperwork for a separation. By legally separating himself from Eleanor, he was finally stopping the financial bleeding. He was living in a cheap motel, taking the city bus to work because he could not secure a loan for a used car, and eating cheap sandwiches. But he was quietly sending $50 a week to Leo, which Leo immediately deposited into a savings account. David was finally learning how to build a foundation from the absolute bottom, one slow, painful brick at a time. I drove us back to my house. The contrast between my home and the one we had just left was profound. My house was small. The furniture was old, and the paint was plain, but the walls were solid. The roof was paid for. Nobody could ever come to my front porch with a clipboard and ask me for the keys. We carried the 2 boxes inside. The market had completely corrected itself. The toxic assets were entirely gone, and my grandson was finally ready to start his real life. 6 months went by. The brutal, suffocating heat of that graduation, summer slowly faded, giving way to a very crisp, very cold winter. In the financial world, 6 months is exactly 2 fiscal quarters. It is enough time for a completely liquidated company to be entirely forgotten by the market. And it is enough time for a brand new enterprise to establish a solid, profitable foundation. That is exactly what happened to my family. Leo did not stay in my spare bedroom for very long. By the end of his 2nd month working at the new engineering firm, he had saved enough money from his paychecks to put a deposit down on a small, one-bedroom apartment closer to his office. It was not a luxury building. There was no gated entrance, no marble lobby, and no valet parking. It was just a quiet, clean, incredibly ordinary brick building on a tree-lined street. I helped him move in on a Saturday morning. We did not hire a moving truck. We just packed the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan a few times and carried the boxes up 2 flights of stairs. When we finally finished unpacking, Leo stood in the middle of his small living room. He looked at his second-hand couch. He looked at his small television. And then he looked at me. And he smiled. It was the smile of a young man who knew that absolutely nobody could ever take this away from him, because he had built it entirely with his own hands. He was finally free. The heavy, crushing weight of his mother's high society aesthetic was completely gone. As for David, his rebuilding process was significantly slower and much more painful. A few weeks before Christmas, David called me and asked if Leo and I would meet him for a cup of coffee. He specifically suggested the little diner on the edge of town, in the same place Leo and I had gone on the night of his graduation. I told him we would be there. When we walked into the diner, David was already sitting in a red vinyl booth near the back window. The physical transformation in my son was absolutely striking, and phrase dud a dud, he was not wearing a tailored, expensive corporate suit. He was wearing a plain Rhined, heavy flannel shirt and a very practical winter jacket. He looked older. He looked tired. But for the very first time in over 10 years, he also looked completely honest. He stood up when we approached the table. He did not try to force a hug. He just offered a quiet, respectful nod and waited for us to sit down. We ordered 3 cups of black coffee. The waitress brought them over in thick, chipped ceramic mugs. David looked down at his mug, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. He took a slow breath. He told us that the divorce was officially finalized because the house had been foreclosed on and they had absolutely zero positive assets. The legal proceedings had actually been incredibly fast. There was nothing left to fight over. The bank had taken the house, the leasing companies had taken the cars, and the credit card companies had entirely written off the debt after ruining their credit scores for the next 7 years. He told us he was still living in a cheap, extended-stay motel near his office. He was still taking the city bus to work. And then, he reached into the pocket of his heavy jacket. He pulled out a small, plain white envelope and slid it across the table toward Leo. Leo looked at the envelope, entirely confused. He did not reach for it right away. "Open it," David said quietly. Leo picked up the envelope and tore the flap open. Inside was a stack of $20 bills. It was exactly $200. "I know it is not much," David said, his voice cracking just a fraction of an inch. "I have been putting away $20 a week since I moved into the motel. I know I cannot pay you back for the 4 years of stress. I know I cannot buy back the graduation day I let your mother ruin. But I want you to have this, for your new apartment, just to buy some groceries. Or pay the electric bill." Leo stared at the money. $200. It was an absolute drop in the bucket compared to the massive executive bonuses David used to chase. It was probably less than what Eleanor used to spend on a single floral arrangement for one of her fake dinner parties. But sitting right there on that cheap diner table, that $200 was the most valuable thing my son had ever produced. It was real. It was not borrowed. It was not leveraged against a high-interest credit card. It was money earned through honest, quiet labor, and given out of genuine love, not out of a desperate need to impress a corporate partner. Leo looked up at his father. He reached across the table and took David's hand. "Thank you, Dad," Leo said softly. I watched my son let out a long, heavy breath, a tear finally slipping down his cheek. He was 42 years old, and he was finally learning how to be a man. He was finally learning that a solid foundation built on cheap flannel and bus rides is infinitely stronger than a glass tower built on leased luxury. Before we left the diner, I asked David about Eleanor. I did not ask out of malice. I asked because a proper forensic audit requires you to know exactly where all the liabilities finally landed. David wiped his eyes and took a sip of his cold coffee. He told me that Eleanor was still living in that tiny, run-down apartment complex in the industrial district. She had finally been forced to get a job. She was working as a front desk receptionist at a mid-level dental office in a strip mall. But the tragedy of Eleanor, David said, shaking his head slowly, is that she absolutely refuses to learn the lesson. She sits behind that reception desk wearing her old, fading designer silk blouses. She tells the dental assistants that she is just working there temporarily while her massive investment portfolio is being restructured. She completely isolates herself from the other employees because she thinks they are beneath her. She spends every single evening sitting completely alone in a cheap apartment, surrounded by peeling paint. desperately clinging to an illusion that is entirely dead. She was living in a prison built entirely out of her own arrogance. She had absolutely no money, no social standing, and no family. But she still refused to let go of the aesthetic. We finished our coffee and walked out into the cold winter air. David hugged Leo in the parking lot. It was a brief, awkward, but entirely genuine embrace. And then, David turned to me. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. "For what?" I asked him. "For letting the house fall down," he replied. "I would have spent the rest of my life trying to hold up the ceiling." I watched my son walk away, heading toward the bus stop at the corner of the street. I got into my 10-year-old sedan, turned the heater on, and drove my grandson back to his quiet, paid-off apartment. The market was completely closed. The long, exhausting weekend of the graduation was completely behind us. There was only one final thing left to do. I needed to go back to my own house, sit in my own quiet living room, and close the ledger on this entire chapter of my life. I drove the rest of the way home in absolute silence. The winter air outside was biting and sharp, but inside my 10-year-old sedan, the heater was running steady and warm. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. When I walked through my front door, the house was perfectly still. It was not the heavy, suffocating stillness of a home waiting for a foreclosure notice. It was the deep, comforting quiet of a sanctuary, a place built on a solid, unshakable foundation. I took off my winter coat, hung it neatly in the hallway closet, and walked straight into my home office. The heavy oak desk looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago. I sat down in my leather chair and looked out the window at my backyard. My tomato garden was completely dormant now, covered in a thin layer of white winter frost. The seasons had changed. The frantic, suffocating heat of the summer was gone, and the cold, clear reality of winter had settled in. I reached down and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out the heavy steel lockbox, set it on the desktop, and punched in the 4-digit combination. The lock clicked open. Inside were the thick folders containing the trust documents for Leo's endowment, along with the old, outdated mortgage guarantee papers that I had legally severed. I did not need to look at them anymore. I did not need Marcus to run any more forensic audits or monitor any more credit scores. The portfolio was officially closed. In my 35 years of investment banking, I spent my entire life calculating the value of things. I looked at balance sheets, profit margins, and corporate liabilities. But the older you get, the more you realize that the most dangerous debts in this world have absolutely nothing to do with money. Eleanor thought she was wealthy because she carried a designer handbag and hosted private chefs in a house she did not actually own. She thought she was powerful because she could manipulate a seating chart and bully her husband into silence. But her entire life was built on borrowed time and stolen equity. She was constantly auditing everyone around her, judging their clothes, their cars, and their hobbies, completely terrified that someone might look closely enough to realize her own vault was entirely empty. She erased my name from my grandson's graduation guest list because she thought a sensible wool cardigan would ruin her high society aesthetic. She traded her family for a networking opportunity, and in the end, the market did exactly what the market always does. It corrected the overvalued asset. It stripped away the least luxury cars. It stripped away the country club membership. It stripped away the massive, echoing house. And it left her sitting behind a reception desk in a cheap dental office, completely isolated, still desperately clinging to the ghost of a life she never actually earned. David had a much harder road ahead of him. He was 42 years old, living in a cheap motel, riding the city bus, and learning how to budget $20 at a time. But as I sat at my desk and thought about that small, white envelope sitting on the diner table, I felt a profound sense of peace. My son had finally hit the absolute bottom. And for the first time in his adult life, he was finding solid ground. He was no longer holding up the ceiling of a burning building. He was finally learning how to build something real. And Leo, I smiled as I closed the lid of the heavy steel lockbox. The metal snapped shut with a quiet, absolute finality. Leo was going to be perfectly fine. He was sitting in a warm, clean apartment that he paid for with his own honest labor. He was going to be a brilliant engineer. He was going to build bridges and structures that could actually withstand the weight of the world, because he finally understood the absolute importance of a strong, honest foundation. I locked the box, put it back into the bottom drawer, and pushed the drawer shut. I walked into my kitchen and put the kettle on the stove. I stood by the counter, waiting for the water to boil, and I realized that I did not feel a single ounce of anger or regret or even triumph. I just felt incredibly light. People like Eleanor will always exist. There will always be people who measure your worth by the logo on your shoes or the price tag on your car. There will always be people who try to make you feel small so they can pretend they are standing on top of the world. But you do not have to argue with them. You do not have to raise your voice or defend your choices or beg for a seat at their miserable, fragile table. You just have to quietly maintain your own boundaries. Protect the people who actually matter, and let their own arrogance do the heavy lifting. Because here is the absolute truth about family, and wealth, and love. Genuine love does not need a VIP ticket to exist. It does not need a public announcement over a stadium speaker. It does not need to be recognized by corporate partners or high society socialites. Genuine love is quiet. It is steady. It is a full-ride scholarship funded anonymously. It is $200 saved up in a motel room. But fake love? Fake love is a debt built on borrowed time. It is a desperate, endless cycle of trying to prove your worth to people who do not care about you at all. And eventually, no matter how carefully you hide the past due notices, the market always calls it in. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If you believe that respect has to be earned through honesty and not assumed through manipulation, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are always more stories to tell. And I would love to see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. And remember to always check the foundation.